The Bermuda Islands are a British territory in the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, located about 1,000 kilometers away from the coast of the USA. It is not a country in the traditional sense, nor is it a state with a developing economy. The Bermuda Islands can boast one of the highest per capita income levels in the world. The country takes pride in its safety for travelers, stunning beaches with pink sand and golf courses. Thanks to these attractions, it annually attracts 500,000 tourists, primarily from the USA. With a small population and low crime rates, local newspapers have always written about tourism and local entertainment, but only until the summer of 1996, when the world was shocked by the murder of a young tourist from Canada, and the subsequent injustice cast a shadow over the idyllic islands. In June 1996, 16-year-old Rebecca Middleton from Belleville, Canada, graduated from the 11th grade with top grades as she had worked hard for it. Rebecca, or Becky, was the youngest daughter of David and Cindy Middleton, who had separated when she was 13 years old. Fortunately, her parents had divorced amicably, and the children enjoyed spending time with both their father and mother. Being an active girl, Rebecca had a passion for water sports, loved sailing, and was involved in windsurfing. She loved spending time with friends, but always remembered the boundaries she shouldn't cross. In general, one could say that many parents dream of having such a daughter, cheerful, active, full of life, yet responsible. This is precisely why David and Cindy reluctantly allowed Rebecca to fly to the Bermuda Islands with her best friend, Ms Meens. Jasmine's father, Rick Meens, lived on the main island, and the girls were supposed to stay at his house and be under his care throughout the vacation. Nevertheless, it took a year of negotiations and communication between the parents over the phone before Cindy and David were convinced that they could let their daughter go so far. However, Becky's parents had no significant reasons to worry. Bermuda had traditionally been considered the safest place for a vacation. On June 20th, 1996, Becky and Jasmine set off for a 6-week vacation. It was a dream journey, and for the first 2 weeks, the girls thoroughly enjoyed it. How could it be otherwise? Picturesque islands surrounded by crystal-clear ocean waters that invited exploration. And then there were endless opportunities to sunbathe on the beach with its astonishing pink sand. On June 27th, Becky celebrated her 17th birthday far from her family. However, Jasmine, Rick, and his wife Lynn ordered a beautiful cake and made every effort to ensure that the celebration would be unforgettable for the guests. During their vacation, the girls met 3 young men from the UK, also visiting for the summer: Russell McCann, Ben Turtle, and Jonathan Cassidy, whose father was a police officer who had been transferred to the island from Britain. On July 2, 1996, it was Russell's turn to celebrate his birthday. The young group had planned to arrive by boat, but the weather interfered with their plans, and due to the rain, they had to abandon that idea. At the last moment, they decided to go to a pub. To celebrate Russell's birthday, the young people chose the oldest and most respected pub, which also happened to be a seafood restaurant. On the Bermuda Islands, alcoholic beverages could be ordered starting from the age of 18. Nevertheless, the girls had a few glasses of beer and cocktails. After leaving the pub, the young people decided to take a walk to their friend's house in the town of St. George's to the east of the main island. They spent some time at their friend's house, but when it was time to return home, the girls were slightly delayed, and they missed the time when they should have called Rick to pick them up. Moreover, Becky and Jasmine had had a few drinks and were worried that Rick would be upset. That's why, at 1:08, the girls called a taxi and went to wait for it on the street. When the taxi didn't show up by 1:45, the girls returned to their friend's house and called the taxi service again. The operator told them that the taxi had come, but the driver hadn't seen them, so he had left. After waiting on the street for another half hour, Jasmine and Becky called again at 2:16 in the morning. Jonathan Cassidy waited with them for a while, but decided to go inside the house and go to sleep. He left them waiting for the taxi, being confident that the taxi would arrive soon. Perhaps he thought they could return to the house and knock. The other guys were already asleep. By this time, dawn was approaching, and the girls were getting nervous. They were sure that Rick would scold them when they got home. In reality, Rick wasn't too angry or extremely concerned. After all, it was not unusual for teenagers to lose track of time while celebrating a birthday, and it was hard for him to imagine that anything could happen in a place as safe as Bermuda. It never crossed his mind that something might go wrong. While Jasmine and Rebecca were standing on the street, the lights in their friend's house went out, signaling that everyone had gone to sleep and it would be inconvenient to knock on their door again. At this moment, a local acquaintance of theirs, 21-year-old Dean Lattimore, arrived on a motorcycle. He asked them if they needed a taxi, to which the girls replied that they had already called one and were waiting for it to arrive. They had only talked for about 2 minutes when another motorcycle approached from the opposite direction, carrying 2 local guys. They seemed to recognize Dean and gave him a nod of greeting. The young men asked the girls what they were doing on the street at that time in a small town where they obviously weren't locals. The motorcycle driver showed a clear interest in Rebecca and complimented her on the necklace that Jasmine had given her. The guys assured the girls that the taxi wouldn't come, and they offered to give them a ride. Jasmine reasoned that they didn't have helmets, and they didn't want any trouble because of it. The guys replied that they had 1 spare helmet. Another one was found with Dean. Honestly, Rebecca and Jasmine didn't want to get on the motorcycle with unfamiliar guys, but it was clear they had no better option. Mobile phones weren't common at the time. There were no nearby payphones, and the buses wouldn't start running for several hours, and the taxi still hadn't arrived. What choice did they have? Of course, they could have woken up their friends and called Jasmine's dad, but the girls dismissed that idea. Since Jasmine was slightly bigger in build than Rebecca, she sat on Dean's motorcycle, and Rebecca sat on the other motorcycle between the 2 guys. All of them set off. The guy's motorcycle with Rebecca on it was in front, and Dean and Jasmine followed behind. Jasmine had asked Dean not to rush, and he carefully drove her. As a result, the guys on the other motorcycle quickly distanced themselves. At the bridge, Dean chose a shorter route, and around 2:30 in the morning, Jasmine was already home. She was surprised that her friends were not there yet, as Rebecca should have arrived before her. The spare key was in its place by the door, and the door to the house was locked. With growing anxiety, Jasmine waited for Rebecca. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she went to her dad and said that she had lost Rebecca. Rick couldn't understand how the girls could have separated, but he got in the car and they began to look for Rebecca. Jasmine was too scared to admit to her dad that her friend had gotten on the motorcycle with 2 completely unfamiliar guys. She only said that she had last seen her on the bridge. While Jasmine and her father were looking for Rebecca near the bridge where Jasmine had last seen her, about 13 kilometers away, 4 friends were driving along Ferry Reach Road after a pleasant evening. Dana Rollins, a club DJ, was behind the wheel. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught sight of a figure lying in the darkness on the road. Dana got out of the car and cautiously approached. He saw that it was a young girl, a teenager. She was partially undressed, lying with her back to the car, curled up in a ball. The girl was covered in blood, and it appeared that she had been attacked before she managed to crawl to the road. She couldn't speak due to a deep wound on her throat, but attempted to say something. Dana tried to stop the bleeding and encouraged the girl to hold on and save her energy for help. At the same time, his friends drove to the nearest payphone to call for an ambulance, while Jasmine and her father were searching for Rebecca at the bridge, where Jasmine last saw her. An ambulance sped past them. Jasmine sensed that the ambulance was going to pick up Rebecca and told her father so. However, Rick cut his daughter off, not allowing her to even think that something bad could have happened. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but was still late. The medics couldn't do anything to help Rebecca. When Rick and Jasmine returned home, the sun had risen. Rick immediately called the police to report Rebecca's disappearance. The responding officer informed him that they would have to wait for 24 hours before they could file a missing person report. Rick argued with the officer, trying to convince him that Rebecca could not have simply gone somewhere when she suddenly received word that he was placed on hold. When the officer returned to the call, he asked Rick to come to Ferry Reach Road. Rick inquired if they had found Becky, but the only response he received was, "Go to the bridge." In frustration, Rick hung up the phone, and he and his daughter drove to the indicated location. Even from a distance, they spotted numerous police cars and officers, clearly working at a crime scene. Rick got out of the car and asked his daughter to wait for him. He didn't want her to see what he feared he would find beyond the police barricade. Approaching the scene, Rick noticed a body bag. Investigators unzipped the bag and asked him if he could identify the person inside. Rick admitted that Rebecca had been so severely injured and had lost so much blood that he had to look a second time before he could tell the investigators that it was her. He attempted to embrace her, but the police officers pulled him away. Hysterics overcame him, and he cried out in pain and despair, striking the police van in disbelief. Jasmine, who was still sitting in the car, heard her father's screams and realized that Rebecca was no more. On the way back home, both father and daughter were in a deeply sorrowful state. Rick didn't know how to tell Rebecca's parents that their daughter was dead, not just dead, but brutally murdered. How could he tell them that he hadn't protected their daughter, whom he had promised to take care of? Having given Rick the opportunity to inform Rebecca's family, the investigators wanted to speak with him and his daughter. It's difficult to imagine the horror that overcame Rick when Jasmine informed the police that Rebecca had gotten on a motorcycle with two strangers. This was the first time he had heard of it. Jasmine didn't know their names, only that they were two young men on a motorcycle, a description that could fit many local men. She knew Dean, the one who had driven her home, but not the other two. The brutal murder of a young Canadian tourist on Bermuda, a place heavily dependent on tourism, could have had a significant impact on the country's economy. Therefore, there would have been immense pressure on the investigators to solve the case as quickly as possible. However, the inexperience of many of the investigators, as well as potential breaches of standard police procedures, complicated the collection of evidence. Nevertheless, they managed to gather evidence at the crime scene. Rebecca's bustier had been cut from her shoulders, and her skirt was torn in the front. The necklace that had caught the attention of the men was nowhere to be found, possibly taken by the perpetrators as a souvenir. Typically, in cases of suspicious deaths in Bermuda, an autopsy is conducted by an outside expert. However, in this case, the autopsy was performed by a local hospital pathologist, who openly acknowledged a potential lack of skills and experience for such work. Still, the authorities pushed for haste, and he concluded that Rebecca had been subjected to brutal violence before her death, suffering deep wounds that affected vital organs, including the neck wound, which led to her demise due to shock and severe bleeding. 4 men who found Rebecca's body were questioned and quickly ruled out as suspects. The police promised Rebecca's parents to find her killer as soon as possible and devoted all their efforts to the search, investigating local young men with legal troubles. After that, they invited Dean for identification, but even here, they deviated from the standard police procedure. There was no two-way mirror or opaque barrier between Dean and the suspects, nothing that would allow the witness's identity to remain hidden. What was even more horrifying was that Dean recognized one of the guys who had driven Becky, but he knew how dangerous and vengeful that person was. He was afraid for his family, his son, and ultimately for his own life. So he claimed that the guys were wearing helmets and he didn't see their faces. Following the unsuccessful identification, the police, in a hurry to apprehend the culprits, offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the criminals. They continued to interrogate potential suspects when a breakthrough occurred on July 9th, 6 days after the crime. Dean decided that what had happened was too terrible to let the killers escape punishment, and, despite his fear, he provided the investigators with the names of the guys who had approached the girls on a motorcycle that evening. They were 21-year-old Jamaican native Kirk Mundy and 17-year-old Justice Smith. Kirk had just been released from prison on bail awaiting trial for a bank robbery case. Justice Smith came from a decent family but had dropped out of school and was getting into trouble after associating with Kirk. The guys were arrested and charged with Rebecca's murder. In Bermuda, 17-year-old Justice could be tried as an adult, so they faced the highest possible punishment if convicted. Shortly after that, another witness contacted the police. He explained that he and a friend had a breakdown near the crime scene. While they were waiting for assistance, Justice and Kirk pulled over to chat with them. The witness stated that Kirk appeared unusually disheveled, and there was blood on his shirt. Nevertheless, Kirk and Justice continued to deny any involvement and insisted that they were nowhere near that road. Justice claimed they were at a nightclub, while Kirk stated that he was at home with his girlfriend, who was expecting a child. The police collected DNA samples from the two and sent them to a laboratory in Canada for testing. While awaiting the test results, another witness emerged, having seen the two guys on the motorcycle at 3:20 in the morning. He noticed that a white piece of fabric covered the motorcycle's registration number. Interestingly, the white vest that Rebecca was wearing that evening was never found. Kirk Mundy knew that he was facing a serious charge for murder. Understanding that he was linked to the crime scene and that his DNA was being analyzed, he requested a meeting with a lawyer. The lawyer directly told him that if his DNA matched the semen found on the girl, his alibi of being at home would be completely disproven. In response, Kirk decided to provide a statement to the prosecutor, admitting that he had assaulted the girl and that Eustace had killed her, making him an involuntary accomplice to the crime. Kirk revealed that he had thrown the knife, used in the murder, into the water from a bridge. The prosecutor's office, under immense pressure to solve the case, quickly struck a deal with Kirk before waiting for the DNA test results in exchange for his testimony against Eustace. In court, Kirk apologized before being sentenced to 5 years in prison for his involvement in the crime. The remarkably lenient sentence deeply upset Rebecca's parents, but their nightmare was far from over. Just 2 days after this sentence, the results of the DNA comparison arrived. Justice Smith's DNA was not found at the crime scene. Only Kirk Mundy's DNA was present. Kirk had humiliated the girl and at the very least had participated in her murder. Kirk had outwitted the prosecutor, the police, and probably his own lawyer, as they all believed him. The prosecutor confronted Kirk, demanding an explanation for how his DNA ended up on the girl. Kirk claimed that as they were riding on the motorcycle, Rebecca whispered that she was willing to be intimate with him. After he fulfilled her wish, he claimed he walked to the water to wash up when he suddenly heard Rebecca scream, "No!" He rushed back, and it appeared as though Eustace was striking her in the face. However, a few seconds later, he noticed that she was bleeding from her throat. They quickly fled on the motorcycle. The prosecutor did not believe a word of Kirk's story and attempted to accuse him of intentionally murdering Rebecca, but it was too late. By law, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Kirk slipped through the prosecutor's fingers. The prosecutors decided to at least seek justice in the case against Justice Smith. There was no sign of his semen on Rebecca, possibly because he used a condom. 2 condom wrappers were found near the crime scene, but such evidence wouldn't be admissible in court. Therefore, the most crucial piece of evidence became the knife, approximately 10 centimeters long with a broad blade, that the culprits had discarded from the bridge. The prosecution called on renowned American pathologist Michael Baden to examine it, who also re-examined the autopsy results. He explained that when a serrated knife makes contact with skin, it leaves markings as unique as fingerprints. The wounds on Rebecca's body matched the knife found under the bridge. In Justice's home, a set of relatively rare knives from the same manufacturer as the murder weapon was discovered, missing 1 knife. The evidence continued to mount, but proving anything was difficult because the initial autopsy had been conducted with errors. For instance, the body had been washed before the examination was completed. Additionally, no skin samples from the attacker's nails were taken from Rebecca. These samples could have revealed who she had struggled with before her death, Kirk, Justice, or both. However, based on his experience, the pathologist concluded that the person responsible for her death was not acting alone. The pathologist's analysis indicated that before Rebecca's murder, she had suffered shallow but highly distressing and emotionally intimidating wounds, which he referred to as Jamaican torture. The distinct edges of these wounds and the absence of cuts on the girl's hands suggested that one assailant held her head and arms behind her, while the other used the serrated knife to scratch and cut her forehead. She was on her knees at the time, and her tormentor loomed over her. The pathologist believed that these torturous wounds were meant to coerce the girl into doing things during the attack that she had initially resisted. After the attacker obtained what he wanted, he slashed her throat with the knife. Rebecca died within minutes, and due to her internal injuries, she wouldn't have been able to make it to the road by herself. Again, 2 people had to carry her. The bruises on her wrists and smudges on her boots pointed clearly to 2 individuals. After this ordeal, the perpetrators left her to die from blood loss. In November 1998, the trial of Justice Smith began, and his parents hired a lawyer from Britain to defend their son. Suddenly, a week before the trial, the lead prosecutor left the Bermuda Islands, and his replacement had little time to prepare for the trial. Complicating matters, all the evidence against Eustace was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the evidence appeared to be quite reliable. The last time Rebecca was seen, Kirk and Justice were taking her on a motorcycle, and they were identified by Dean. Witnesses connected the guys to the crime scene. The pathologist clearly stated that 2 individuals were involved in the crime. The murder weapon matched a set of knives in Eustace's kitchen. Shouldn't that have been enough? After the prosecution finished presenting the case, Eustace's lawyer didn't call a single witness. He simply argued that there was no semen, hair, fiber, or blood that could link Eustace to the murder or violence, and thus the case against him should be dismissed, and the jury should be discharged. Nobody expected what would happen next. Out of the blue, the news broke that the judge had agreed with the defense's arguments and was discharging the jury. Justice Smith walked out of the courtroom as a free man. Rebecca's parents were in shock. Cindy rushed out of the courtroom and David sat there, unable to move. Many in the courtroom were brought to tears by the injustice. Naturally, the prosecutor filed an appeal, arguing that the judge had not considered the circumstantial evidence, which was substantial. The Bermuda Court of Appeal ordered a new trial for Justice, but this decision was challenged in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of the United Kingdom, acting as the country's highest court. They ruled that Justice could not be tried a second time for the same offense. Their decision was final, putting an end to any further appeals. In 2002, Justice Smith attacked 2 women with a knife, injuring one of them. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but the judge released him, considering the time he had already spent in custody. Kirk Mundy served 20 years in prison for a robbery he was initially charged with before Rebecca's murder and for weapons possession. Upon his release, he was deported to Jamaica. Since nobody faced punishment for Rebecca's murder, the nightmare for her family continued. They deserved more. Every day, her family would come to the courthouse, hoping and waiting for justice. In the following years, Rebecca's family desperately sought justice for their daughter. They made several attempts to reopen the case, but in 2008, David announced that he could no longer financially support the battle against Bermuda's legal system. Ironically, 10 years after the murder, the government of the island compensated the Middleton family for the pain and suffering they endured, cutting a check for $2,840. On February 19, 2001, at the Battlebridge Basin, a part of the Regent's Canal in London, 10 body parts belonging to an unidentified woman were discovered. The body parts were found in 6 different bags and weighed down with bricks. Who was she, and who killed her? These hastily dismembered remains belonged to an ex-girlfriend of John Sweeney, a jealous, perpetually drunken, and vengeful sadist. He referred to himself as a scalp hunter, but the press dubbed him the Canal Killer. Born John Patrick Sweeney on Saturday, October 13, 1956, the boy grew up in Kirkdale, a working-class district of Liverpool. Sweeney's childhood was unremarkable and devoid of significant events. Although his family was poor, his parents instilled in him a sense of pride, moral values, and the importance of hard work. The boy dreamed of studying art, but he was convinced to choose a more reliable profession. Thus, after training as a carpenter, for 5 years John traveled to different countries, working on construction sites with a bag full of tools, pockets full of cash, and eyes fixed on women. It was during this little-known episode of his life that something changed in John. When he returned to Britain several years later, he came back as an envious, jealous, and malicious person whose life was consumed by a passion for alcohol, illicit substances, and violence. Upon returning to Liverpool, John still looked like the boy who had left a few years earlier, with his tousled red hair and mischievous sparks in his eyes. But his almost childlike face, which always seemed kind and smiling, concealed a growing rage within him. After meeting the lovely Anne Bramley in 1976, John married her and moved in with her. Soon after, they had children. However, it was not a happy union. John was either absent from home and uninvolved in raising the children, or he behaved aggressively and horrifically abused his wife. He often used different aliases, such as Joe Johnson, Joe Carroll, or Liverpool Joe, to hide the increasing number of charges against him for various offences. In 1979, after 3 years of marriage, concerned for the safety of her children and repeatedly reporting her husband to the police, Anne made a courageous decision and filed for divorce. 2 years later, she gave John one last chance, believing that he had changed, overcome his addiction, and that a bright future awaited them. But her husband had not changed. He was still intoxicated, drugged, and dangerous, and he was consumed by a desire for revenge. He was not going to allow her to leave him again. Their second marriage lasted barely a year. Anne escaped to her family in the middle of the night. But no matter how far she ran or how carefully she hid, John always found her. In November 1982, settling with her children in a cottage in a small town, and thought she had found refuge, but her peace was shattered because John Sweeney followed her. In the evening, when a piercing wind blew from the hills, covering the moon with dense clouds, and the snow crunched under his feet, John approached the new home of the family. Through a gap in the curtains, he noticed a light in the house but heard no sound and saw no movement. Realizing that nobody was home, the man broke the lock on the back door. Inside, seeing food on the table, children's toys on the floor, and family photos on the fireplace mantel, he felt even more acutely rejected by Anne. John slipped into the darkness of his wife's bedroom, opened the closet, and hid inside. And while he stood there, surrounded by familiar things, inhaling the scent of her perfume, surrounded by everything that reminded him of her departure, John waited for his wife's return with a hammer in one hand and an axe in the other. He didn't have to wait long. Just 2 minutes later, he heard the jingling of her keys. The front door opened, and light sequentially filled each room until he heard quiet footsteps in the bedroom. From the tension, the man's finger joints turned pale as he anxiously gripped the hammer and axe, prepared for a furious attack on his soon-to-be ex-wife. Waiting for the perfect moment, John burst out of the closet and saw 2 police officers in front of him, thick, strong guys who already had handcuffs ready. John dropped the weapons, and thoughts raced through his mind about how to explain who he was and what he was doing in the closet with a hammer and axe. He claimed he was preparing a surprise for his wife. One can only guess what kind of surprise it would have been if the police officers hadn't shown up. However, luckily for Anne and the children, they were having a pleasant evening at the neighbor's house when they heard the sound as if someone had entered their home. Assuming it was a burglar, they called the police. John was arrested, but he was not charged with attempted murder or anything similar. Since it is difficult to prove intentions to commit a crime, and considering that everything happened in what could formally be considered his own home, the law couldn't do anything to him. He was released on the condition of staying away from Anne. John started over and moved to London. He returned to Liverpool only to visit his mother. Although he and Anne crossed paths more than once, they managed to maintain civilized relations for the sake of the children until her death in 2001. In the same year, 10 body parts, placed in 6 separate bags and weighted down with bricks, were dumped at the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London. But the body in the canal did not belong to Anne. John never again attempted to take her life. Perhaps he never had the opportunity again, perhaps he still loved her, or perhaps he knew it was wrong to deprive the children of a caring mother. Thus, with the same fury in his eyes, jealousy in his heart, and impatient tremor in his hands, John set off once again in search of love, an unsuspecting girl whom he would attempt to control, and her name was Melissa Halstead. But this time, he turned to his other passion, art, and his dark paintings would unveil the veil of mystery over his much more sinister plans. Born in Ohio, Melissa Halstead was a bright, courageous, and cheerful girl whose free-spirited nature was balanced by kindness and inner warmth. Melissa always saw the best in people, and although it took her a long time to trust a stranger enough to become her friend, once you became her friend, you became her friend forever. At the age of 15, scouts from the renowned Ford modeling agency in New York took notice of the beautiful and striking girl, and that's where her career began. She traveled across America, Europe, and Asia. By 1986, after a successful modeling career and obtaining education as a makeup artist and photographer, Melissa settled in London in anticipation of a new chapter in her life. Melissa hardly told her family anything about her new boyfriend, whom everyone called Liverpool Joe. Whatever she saw in this red-haired, moody figure was a mystery to everyone, but whatever it wasn't worth it. Because the man didn't hesitate to disfigure her beautiful face, using his fists in fits of drunken rage. These were alarming signs, and Melissa repeatedly tried to leave. Over the course of 12 months of living together, Melissa and John Sweeney, the police were called to her rescue twice when he brutally beat her. But both times, John only received a slap on the wrist, forcing him to pay a fine of £5. In April 1988, The man frightened poor Melissa so much, waving a knife, that in a gruesome foreshadowing of her fate, she told her sister that if she ever disappeared, it meant John had killed her. This time, the court banned him from ever approaching the girl. Melissa's work visa was about to expire, and she continued to travel thousands of kilometers away from John, visiting Austria, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But no matter how far she went, how skillfully she hid, or how cautiously she noticed traces, he always found her. His paranoia fueled by alcohol, his jealousy fueled by rejection, and the court conditions that had no significance beyond Britain allowed him to track down his supposedly unfaithful girlfriend to her new apartment in Vienna, Austria. Without realizing that the shattered relationship was his fault, and driven mad by the thought that Melissa was cheating on him, John burst into the house through the back door, found and gagged her neighbor, and searched the apartment. He examined every cabinet in search of signs of her infidelity. Melissa had learned from the experiences of his furious attacks. She knew there was no point in arguing, trying to convince him otherwise, or even dignifying him with a response. Instead, understanding that he needed time to cool down, she bought him a ticket to Amsterdam. Whether it was a clever ploy to distract a dangerous lover, a kind gesture to give him a chance to calm down, or an honest promise to resume their relationship is unknown, but it worked. John took the ticket and left. But a few days did not calm him down. On the contrary, he blamed Melissa for everything he had ever experienced because of women who deceived and rejected him. She rejected him like Anne, abandoned him like Anne, and destroyed him like Anne. John's anger came full circle, and it was time to finish what he had started, to seek revenge. On Friday, November 4th, 1988, 4 days later and almost 6 years after the failed attack on Anne, John approached Melissa's apartment. Unlike that night, Melissa was at home. Unlike that night, he didn't break in but knocked on the door. Unlike that night, when Melissa saw her stalker had returned, an argument ensued. But just like that night 6 years ago in Anne's cottage, John was prepared. The knuckles of his right hand turned white with impatience as he clenched a hammer. He told Melissa that he had calmed down and simply forgot something in her apartment. Waiting for the moment when Melissa turned her back to him, John gritted his teeth, his hand shot up, and he brought down the steel edge of the hammer on the girl's head. Melissa felt a powerful blow, and her vision instantly darkened, but miraculously she survived. Lying in a hospital bed with bruises and a brain fracture, she declared that all she wanted was to help him, but now she understood that he truly hated her. John was arrested on the same day. Hatred for the girl continued to boil in him while in prison. In his troubles, he blamed only her. And here he resorted to his favorite pastime again, drawing. His drawings were not only frightening, realistic, and highly detailed, but they also served as a confession of the thoughts and desires that consumed him. His imagination was so deranged that it's hard to describe it in words. The most disturbing sketch he sarcastically titled Romantic Weekend 2 in Austria. But if it could be characterized in any way, it was certainly not romantic. However, Melissa knew nothing about the drawings. She believed his tears and assurances that she was all he had. So she took an unexpected step. The judge sentenced John to 12 months in prison and a 10-year ban on entering Austria to protect his victim from any danger. But he was released earlier after an emotional plea from the person he almost killed, Melissa. And on Monday, March 27, 1989, after serving only half of his sentence, 34-year-old John Sweeney walked free, inhaling the fresh Austrian air as the cold breeze played with his red beard. The stunningly beautiful Blom, a former model, kissed him on the lips. Melissa arrived in a car full of luggage to pick up John. They headed to the Netherlands, where they wouldn't be bothered by the deportation order, to start a new life together. However, those 6 months in prison did nothing to rid the man of his drinking habit, his use of illicit substances, his paranoia, jealousy, and his obsession with violence and torture. And their new home was as libertine and indulgent as it was an unsuitable place for someone like him. Although John occasionally worked, His earnings were only enough for alcohol, and it was Melissa's successful career that allowed them to pay for housing, food, and other expenses. Month after month, the beatings were repeated, which the girl concealed behind expertly applied makeup and poorly thought-out excuses. Thanks to her work as a photographer and makeup artist, she traveled a lot, but the more she was absent, the more John drank and filled himself with jealousy and rage. Finally, in late April 1990, Melissa returned home to Amsterdam, to the apartment she shared with her boyfriend. She decided to break up with him for good. On Thursday, May 3, 1990, in a coastal town called Rotterdam, located 50 miles from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a military-style bag appeared on the surface of a canal. Upon seeing it, 2 police officers decided it was either stolen luggage or discarded trash. Inside, they found the torso of a naked woman. Just the torso, without hands, feet, or a head, and there were no belongings or documents present. The perpetrator had removed them and snapped the unfortunate victim's spine in half to fit her into the bag. She had spent just over a week in the water before being discovered. However, that was all the police could determine for certain because the killer had made maximum efforts to destroy all clues to her identity. The skull injury from a recent attack by her boyfriend could have provided a clue to her identity besides dental records, but all the police had was an unnamed torso, lacking any name, teeth, surgical scars, birthmarks, tattoos, or fingerprints. Since no missing persons matching her description had been reported in Rotterdam, Melissa was marked as Jane Doe and buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. We will never know exactly how or where she died. We do not know how her killer transported her body from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. Perhaps he took a train, wondering what other passengers would think if they knew what was in his bag. But we do know that in Rotterdam, he chose a canal that ran through the heart of the city, waited for the opportune moment, and simply tossed the bag into the water. As Melissa worked a lot and traveled on assignments, her family in Ohio did not immediately realize they hadn't heard from her in a while. The last time she left a message on the answering machine, congratulating her mother on her birthday, and then she stopped calling. So in November 1990, the family hired a lawyer to investigate her disappearance. But they realized it too late. Her apartment was completely empty and meticulously cleaned, with no trace of the former tenants. Melissa had vanished, and John returned to Britain, embarking on his search for love, girls, once again. And her name was Deia Bamer. Having met John at a pub in early 1991, Deia was struck by the charisma of a man who lived a seemingly heavenly life. Being overly trusting by nature, she quickly allowed John to move into her apartment, just 1.5 miles from the Battlebridge Basin Canal in London's Paddington. But together they appeared to be a strange pair. She was a fragile blonde, a nurse who saved lives, and he was a red-haired psychopath with one past murder, one attempted murder, and at least one future murder. Deia brought warmth and coziness into the home, while John complemented it with illicit substances, alcohol, a tarantula, stacks of horror magazines, and a collection of gruesome paintings depicting scenes of violence, severed body parts, blood, torture, and headless female bodies. As before, he quickly revealed his true nature, striving to exert full control over Deia's life and exploding with rage if things didn't go the way he wanted. 2 years later, Deia gathered the courage to ask him to leave. He agreed, but he kept delaying the moment, continuing to exert control over every aspect of her life. In 1994, Deia managed to escape his watchful gaze and spent a day with a friend. When she returned, John flew into a rage. As punishment, he tied the helpless woman to her bed, using the same rope he had once used to bind Melissa's lifeless body. For unbearable 48 hours, he tortured Deia, repeatedly violating her, beating her, strangling her, and threatening her. John held a gun to her head and threatened to cut out her tongue with a kitchen knife if she screamed. In his frenzy, he began to tell her the story of his previous girlfriend, who had tried to leave him and supposedly met her end in the canals of Rotterdam. Allegedly, he caught her with 2 Germans. He killed all three, not knowing what to do with them. He sat with the bodies for 3 days. On the third day, he dismembered them, packed them into bags, and threw them into the canal. Deia had studied John well and didn't even attempt to argue, curse, resist, or scream. She didn't even allow herself to think about it, as if he could read her thoughts. Perhaps that's why, like Anne, he didn't kill her. And no one knows why. The man fled to Germany, but since the police knew his appearance and the fake names he used, he was arrested and deported back to Britain. Her tormentor sat in prison, but Deia was convinced that he would find a way to get to her sooner or later. On Thursday, December 26, 1994, 3 days before Christmas, John was put under house arrest. Just a few hours later, as the sun was setting, with a cold winter wind and snowflakes falling from the sky, Deia finished her shift and carefully rode her bicycle onto the road leading to her home. The dark street was empty, illuminated only by the flickering lights of television screens, Christmas garlands, and the dim orange glow of street lamps. Deia leaned her bicycle against the fence near the steps that led to her apartment entrance. It was quiet, peaceful, and safe, or so it seemed. As always, she propped the door with a brick and went back to get her bicycle. Deia was already halfway up the steps, looking around, asking herself if he was hiding in the darkness, when she glanced to the right again and saw his enraged face. Without wasting a second, Deia quickly pushed the brick, allowing the door of her house to slam shut right in front of her. She knew it was better to confront John on the street. If he pushed her into the house, she wouldn't stand a chance to escape. With raised hands, bulging eyes, and clenched teeth, John struck the fragile and defenseless woman with a 2-kilogram axe while reaching for a knife. He hit her in the chest, piercing her lung, then her thigh, and swung the axe, severing the tip of his finger. Deia could have died, but she didn't. She pulled the bicycle towards her to shield herself from the blows. The sound of the axe scraping against the metal of the bicycle was heard by her neighbor, Giles Allen. Grabbing a baseball bat, he rushed out of his house and chased after John on the street. But John quickly vanished into the darkness, being the coward that he was, afraid to confront a worthy opponent, someone like himself. For the next 6 years, while John remained on the run, friends warned Deia to be cautious, believing that he would come back to finish what he started. But Deia didn't care anymore because she was no longer herself. And even though, after 6 years, 10 parts of a woman's body, carefully packed into 6 different bags, would be discovered at Battlebridge Basin, a London dock in the Regent's Canal, bearing a striking resemblance to Melissa's murder, Deia Bamer would not be the victim. That woman was still alive, because she still had to become John Sweeney's future ex-girlfriend. Having gone on the run, John didn't make much effort to lay low. He headed north, where he visited his mother, as well as his ex-wife Anne and their children. On January 2, 1995, just 11 days after the attack on Deia, John sent a letter to the police and Scotland Yard, boasting about his crimes and claiming they would never catch him. Since the red-haired butcher was easy to find, he decided to hide in another European country. He disappeared from all radars for 6 years. What happened to him during those years, where he was, what he did, and whom he possibly killed, remains unknown. The only certainty is that he returned to his gruesome drawings, promising brutal retribution against women who dared reject him. However, in early 2000, he came back to Britain, where he resumed his search for love. And her name was Paula Fields. As one of 11 children in a poor family living in the poorest district of Liverpool, Paula's childhood, along with her brothers and sisters, was challenging, but their troubles were only beginning. When Paula was 9 years old, her mother passed away, and the children were sent to relatives or placed in shelters. As she grew older, Paula tried her best to become a great mother to her own children. That's why she decided to move to London in search of a better life for her 3 sons, but things only got worse. After 2 years of constant hunger, suffering, and despair, she turned to the oldest profession. In the autumn of 2000, as a homeless woman of loose morals, with no chance of regaining custody of her children, who had been taken by Child Protective Services, Paula's life seemed to hit rock bottom. It was during this time that she met and fell in love with a bearded, red-haired butcher known as Liverpool Joe. Paula, battered and beaten, moved in with him. But what began as an endless cycle of emotional blackmail, psychological pressure, and physical violence soon led to her demise. At 9:30 a.m. on Friday, December 15, 2000, Paula was last seen entering John's apartment. Just 2 days later, the true nature of her beloved was revealed, and 2 days before he moved out of the rented flat, Paula was never seen alive again. On Monday, February 19, 2001, during the school holidays, 2 school children were fishing at the Battlebridge Basin when they noticed a partially submerged black bag. Being boys, they retrieved the heavy bag, hoping to find treasures or at least stolen valuable items. They were shocked for the rest of their lives when they opened the bag and found bricks and body parts. The police recovered 5 more similar bags from the water, but they did not find any hands, feet, heads, or any items or documents. Like Melissa, Paula could have become another Jane Doe, as John had once again gotten away with murder. Or he would have, if he hadn't made a huge mistake. He left one victim alive. Since the police became aware that the wanted assailant for the attack on Deia Bamer had been seen in London, all constables received his description. On Friday, March 23, 2001, the red-haired butcher Joe Johnson was spotted at a construction site. Knowing that he might be armed, the police added their most prepared officers. He indeed had a knife and a gun in his locker. In his apartment, they found more weapons, ammunition, machetes, a homemade bamboo garrote, a baseball bat, a wig with brunette hair, a change of clothes, an axe, handcuffs, garbage bags, a bag with saws and hammers, and over 200 drawings and poems depicting torture, dismemberment, and the death of women. For the attempted murder of Delia, John was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And although he boasted about many murders of his former girlfriends, as well as presumably 2 Germans whom he allegedly caught in bed with Melissa, without evidence, the law was powerless, and investigators feared that John would be released early from prison in a few years and simply disappear. But then another victim of John provided an important clue that helped remove the dangerous criminal from the streets forever. And she did it from beyond the grave. On June 12, 2007, thanks to the advancement of genetic technology, the Dutch police obtained the DNA of the woman whose torso was pulled out of the Rotterdam Canal 18 years ago. By joining forces, Scotland Yard and the Dutch police not only identified Melissa and Paula but also linked their murders, the method of disposing of the bodies, and the identity of the killer, John Sweeney. In court, the most reliable and crucial evidence against the defendant became his own paintings and poems. Detectives were able to establish a chilling connection between the drawings and the murders he was suspected of. In particular, on one drawing, investigators noticed an element hidden under correction fluid. Under ultraviolet light, forensic experts were able to see what was drawn there. It turned out to be a tombstone with the inscription, "Rest in peace, Melissa." But why would he hide this fragment of the painting if he considered all his works simply art? Because it was evidence he knew about Melissa's death long before her remains were identified. Another painting titled "Beautiful Night" in Vienna depicted an army bag with something inside. It was in such a bag that Melissa was found. However, clues were provided not only by John's paintings. 2 poems represented something like a biographical description of his relationship with Melissa, and 2 hinted or even explicitly spoke of the girl's death. For example, one poem ended with the line, "When I die, perhaps we will become one whole," meaning that she had died, and he knew it for sure. Although the press dubbed John Sweeney as the Canal Killer, he considered himself a scalp hunter as he signed one of his works, an image of a man with a bloodied axe and a scalp with light hair. The hair most likely belonged to Delia, whom he dedicated the piece to, so to speak, wishing her to depart from life in the most painful way possible. The paintings depicting the murder of Paula were no less disturbing, and he continued to paint her even in prison. Although he was never tried for other murders, the police believe that John's drawings may contain clues to the identities of other victims, particularly two women whom the police have never been able to find. They did not find the other body parts of Melissa and Paula. Delia believes that John could have hidden them within the walls of the buildings he worked on as a carpenter. At least, that's what he did with his pet tarantula. On Monday, April 4, 2011, 54-year-old John was found guilty of the murders of Melissa and Paula. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Such a punishment is extremely rare in Britain, but the judge emphasized that Sweeney is too dangerous to ever be released again. November 4, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Photopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Photopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Photopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital, and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber. Saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Photopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business. a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Photopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Photopoulos bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Photopoulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt, but if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at CoStar's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Photopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during CoStar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under CoStar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, The judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished 5th right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the 3rd place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. She got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only won last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old. Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of 2 recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the 2 men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed about getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Elray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice 2 men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, the older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, she realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer, revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live. Not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, But the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Rob Svensson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Rob Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul, found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean, and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search, and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away. They'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her. I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought, she had been shocked just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Alan, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Alan's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. "No," she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Alan, but he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Alan, but this time, she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him. There were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Alan in the head. With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help," she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the two fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Ran as a handsome prince and the other man as stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell T-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone? Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. I will tell you a story. It won't be a happy family tale. It's a story about human psychology, control, and manipulation. And the worst part of this story is not the events unfolding in it. The worst part of this story is that it's true. The story begins in a fast food restaurant where Louise, an employee, is about to experience the worst day of her life. However, the day starts like any other. Employees serve customers, do their jobs, when suddenly a phone call interrupts the routine. A police officer informs about a theft that occurred in the restaurant. He claims that Louise stole a wallet from a customer and asks the assistant manager to inspect her personal belongings and confiscate her phone. After the search yields no results, the officer requests the manager to detain the girl until his arrival. And this is just the first of many increasingly questionable requests awaiting her ahead. In April 2004, Louise Ogborn from Mount Washington, Kentucky, celebrated her 18th birthday. As one of the top 10 students, she looked forward to enjoying her last month of school before pursuing a career in medicine. Louise was not only a talented artist and photographer, but also known for her reputation as a responsible and well-mannered young woman. When her mother lost her job due to health issues, Louise decided to temporarily set aside her dream and started contributing financially to her family. In January 2004, she took a part-time job at McDonald's. Earning $6.35 per hour, Louise was considered a reliable employee who never hesitated to take on extra shifts to help her colleagues. On Friday, April 9th at 4:45 p.m., as Louise was preparing to go home after her shift, she was asked to stay a bit longer to cover for a sick colleague. Without hesitation, she agreed, aiming to assist and earn some extra income. At 4:56, the work phone rang, and Donna Summers, a 51-year-old assistant manager for about 8 months, answered the call. The caller identified himself as Officer Scott. Officer Scott claimed that the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, was also on the line with him. He explained that he was calling because a girl who had recently been in the establishment had her wallet stolen and they suspected someone on Summers' staff. Scott provided a description of the suspect, a young, slender girl with dark hair wearing the restaurant uniform. Summers immediately thought of Louise. Despite Louise having an excellent work record, she fit the description perfectly. Leaving Officer Scott on the line, Summers asked Louise to accompany her to the manager's office. Donna led Louise into the office and locked the door. Donna informed Louise that a police officer accused her of stealing a wallet. Shocked, Louise immediately declared her innocence, stating that she could never steal anything. Donna explained that the police officer had described Louise as a suspect in the theft. Officer Scott was still on the line, and Summers alternated between talking to him and Louise. Scott informed Summers that the girl had a choice. She could consent to a search on the spot, or wait for the officer to arrive, arrest her, and conduct the search at the police station. Learning of these options, Louise began to cry and thought it would be better to go to the police station to resolve the matter there. However, Summers handed the phone to Louise, and after talking to Officer Scott, she agreed to a search right in the restaurant. Scott directed Summers, who relayed instructions to Louise. Initially, Louise was asked to empty her pockets, and she complied without objections. After handing over her keys and mobile phone, Louise showed that there was no stolen wallet in her pockets. However, Scott suspected that it might be hidden under her clothing and ordered her to remove it. It's worth noting that at this point, Kim Dockery, also acting as an assistant manager, arrived for the evening shift. Kim asked what was happening, but Summers refused to explain, following Officer Scott's demand. In the presence of Donna and Kim, Louise reluctantly removed her uniform and was left only in her underwear. She covered her face with her hands and cried while Donna examined her clothing. There was no stolen wallet in her clothes, but this was deemed insufficient. Louise was then ordered to remove the remaining clothes and hand them over to Donna for inspection. Louise complied. All of this became too much for Donna Summers, who started doubting the truthfulness of the accusations against Louise. In response, Scott made a shocking statement. The police were investigating Louise's involvement in more serious crimes, and officers were currently searching her family's home for illicit substances. Thus, Louise's clothing and other belongings were considered evidence in the investigation. Scott ordered Summers to put them in a bag and take them to her car so he could pick them up shortly. During this time, Kim tried to comfort Louise. She gave her an apron to cover herself. As the restaurant was crowded, Kim returned to her work. Summers told the police officer that she also needed to work. Then Officer Scott asked her to find a male employee who would watch over Louise until the police arrived. Summers called 27-year-old restaurant cook Jason Bradley. She left him in the office with Louise and the phone while she returned to her duties. The young man tried not to look at Louise, who was covered with a dirty apron, while listening to Officer Scott's instructions. Learning that Louise had nothing on except the apron, the police officer ordered Jason to take it from her and describe Louise to him. This demand upset Jason. After talking to Scott for just a few minutes, he stormed out of the office and told Donna Summers that he considered it discrimination. He declared to Donna that he wouldn't participate and was going back to the kitchen. Summers didn't understand what had offended Jason and picked up the phone again. She explained to the police officer that there was no one to watch over Louise. In response, Scott asked if she was married. Summers chuckled and admitted that she was engaged. When asked if she trusted her fiancé, Summers naturally answered yes. Scott then asked if her fiancé could come to the restaurant to keep an eye on the girl. Summers agreed to call him. Walter Nix Jr. was a 42-year-old father of two, working as an exterminator and coaching the local youth baseball team. He was generally considered a respected member of the community. He had recently become engaged to Donna Summers. Shortly before 6 p.m., Summers called her fiancé on her mobile phone. She explained that a restaurant employee was suspected of stealing a wallet, and she asked if he could watch over her until the police arrived. Nix agreed. When he arrived at McDonald's, Summers led him into the office and left him alone with Louise and the office phone. Louise stood against the wall, leaning back, crying. As soon as Donna left the office, Officer Scott wasted no time. He ordered Nix to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Unlike Jason, Nix complied with this demand. He did not refuse subsequent instructions. Nix forced Louise to stand on a chair to inspect her more thoroughly. Then he compelled her to jump to ensure she wasn't hiding anything of interest to Officer Scott. Occasionally, Nix handed Louise the phone to speak with the police officer. Scott quickly convinced the girl that if she wanted to keep her job, she should cooperate. Donna or Kim would periodically enter the office. Each time Nix heard them approaching, following Officer Scott's orders, he threw the apron to Louise and gestured for her to be quiet, placing a finger to his lips. When the clock showed 6:50 p.m., Louise had spent almost an hour with Nix. Officer Scott's demands were becoming increasingly alarming. When Louise failed to address Nix with a distinctly polite "sir" and continued asking questions, Nix was ordered to slap her. Despite Louise insisting that Scott's demands were absurd, Nix listened to the police officer, not her. A few minutes later, Summers returned to the office. As she approached to grab something, Louise put her head on her shoulder and quietly pleaded for her to take her away. "Donna, please take me out of here, Donna, please. Please believe me, I didn't do anything wrong," the girl said. She asked Summers to call the police, but Summers replied that they were already waiting for the police to arrive. Summers left again. Louise also wanted to escape, but couldn't. The only way out would be to run through the entire restaurant where there were many customers. Additionally, Louise was frightened by Nix's appearance, as he was much taller and weighed 104 kilograms. When Nix and Louise were alone again, Officer Scott resumed his instructions. He made Nix sit the girl on his lap and kiss her to examine her breath. Later, Louise would recount that at this moment, she became paralyzed and felt as if her consciousness had detached from her body. Shortly before 7:30 p.m., Scott demanded something unimaginable, that Louise remove Nix's pants and satisfy him. The girl cried and pleaded, saying, "No, I haven't done anything wrong. This is ridiculous." but Nix threatened her with physical punishment if she did not comply with the police's orders. Finally, Louise gave in. 10 minutes later, at 7:52 p.m., Donna entered the office to retrieve some gift certificates. Louise and Nix, as before, were in different corners of the office. Following Scott's orders, Nix handed the phone to Summers and left the restaurant, getting into his car. When he arrived home, he called a friend, telling him, "I did something incredibly horrible." At the same time, Donna was ordered to find someone to replace Nix in the manager's office. She chose 58-year-old employee Thomas Sims, who wasn't working that day and had just stopped by the restaurant for coffee and dessert. Summers asked the man to accompany her to the office, where Louise was inside. Baffled, Thomas took the phone, and Summers left him alone with the girl. Following the familiar pattern, Officer Scott ordered Thomas to take the apron from Louise and describe her to him. Thomas refused to comply and went out to find Summers. He told her about Scott's outrageous request and stated, "Something is not right here." Thomas demanded to return the girl's clothes and call the police. Summers, shocked, called the restaurant's general manager, Lisa Siddons, who was supposedly on the other line with Officer Scott the entire time. Siddons answered the call with an evidently tired voice, having no idea what Summers was talking about and explaining that she had been sleeping. Once Summers realized she had been deceived, the fake police officer abruptly ended the conversation. By this time, Louise had been in the office for almost 3 hours. Shivering from cold and shock, she asked if she needed to come to work tomorrow. Kim reassured the girl that she could take as much time off as needed. Louise was given back her clothes and allowed to get dressed, while Summers started apologizing. Panicking restaurant employees and managers gathered in the office. After discussing the situation among themselves, around 9 p.m., they decided to call the police. Since the police station was less than a kilometer away, real police officers arrived within just 5 minutes. Buddy Stump, a detective from the city police station, was among the colleagues who arrived at the establishment and couldn't believe his ears when he heard what had happened. The surveillance camera in the office captured everything that occurred with Louise. The video infuriated the detective, and he suspected that someone had made the call using a prepaid phone card from within the McDonald's to observe how the prank unfolded. The next day, the local police chief decided to search for information about similar pranks on the internet. To the surprise of both Chief and Detective Stump, the search yielded hundreds of matches. Similar calls were documented in various states. In each case, the caller pretended to be a police officer or a manager, then asked the store or restaurant manager to assist in an investigation. The requests always involved a thorough search of young women. The prankster targeted fast food chain restaurants in small towns and had been active for 12 years. Interestingly, this wasn't the first incident in Kentucky. In 2000, a McDonald's manager responded to a call from someone claiming to be a police officer. The caller suspected a customer of a crime and convinced the manager to remove her clothes to act as bait for the alleged perpetrator. He guaranteed that undercover officers were monitoring the situation and would come to her rescue before the suspect could harm her. In another incident at a Burger King in Indiana, the fake officer persuaded the manager to search a young female employee. When the girl's father arrived, as usual, to take her home, he had to literally jump over the counter and forcibly make the manager release his daughter. By the end of 2003, there were almost 60 similar incidents reported. Upon learning the extent of the prankster's crimes, Detective Buddy Stamp set a goal to find and apprehend him once and for all. Fortunately, someone in the McDonald's restaurant managed to dial *69 when Officer Scott finished the call. This function allowed them to trace the call. Detective Stamp determined that a prepaid AT&T phone card was used for the call, sold at a Walmart in Panama City, Florida, on April 9th at 3:02 p.m., less than 2 hours before the incident with Louise began. Stamp's colleagues in Panama City connected him with Detective Victor Flaherty, an investigator from Massachusetts, who was probing similar calls to Boston restaurants. Flaherty also linked the Boston calls to prepaid AT&T cards sold in Panama City supermarkets. By comparing surveillance camera images of card buyers at Walmart, the police discovered that the person of interest was a man in the uniform of a local prison supervisor. They quickly identified the suspect as 38-year-old David Stewart. Stewart was married and raising 5 children, having worked in the prison for 11 months. Previously, he had worked as a security guard in a shopping center and as a truck driver. Flaherty went to Stewart's home, introduced himself, and asked if he had a prepaid phone card. The man sweated profusely and inquired if anyone was harmed. When told that no one was physically harmed, but the psychological recovery would take years, he exclaimed, "Finally, it's all over." Despite his exclamation, Stewart denied any knowledge of the calls or having a phone card. He called a lawyer and invoked his right to remain silent. Police searched Stewart's trailer home, finding numerous police journals and dozens of rejected police job applications. Only one phone card was found in the trailer, and it turned out to be not the one used for the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington, although it was used for 9 other calls in 2003. Law enforcement in Mount Washington charged Stewart, and he was transferred to Kentucky. In case of a guilty verdict, he faced a 15-year prison sentence. Around the same time, Louise agreed to give an interview and share what happened during that incident. She explained how she trusted Donna Summers, believing that as an assistant manager, she would take care of her employees. Louise confessed that her greatest desire at that moment was to escape from the office, but in her perception, fleeing from the office would be equivalent to fleeing from the police. Additionally, her family depended financially on her job, and she feared losing it. She also noted that her parents had taught her to obey and not argue when an adult asked her for something. Louise's interview was supplemented with comments from a clinical psychologist who confirmed that her description of feeling as if her consciousness had separated from her body was common among people who had experienced similar situations. As a result of the prank call, Walter Nix faced serious charges. Donna was shown what her fiancé had done to Louise, and she immediately ended her relationship with him. Initially, Summers was suspended from work at the restaurant and later dismissed. McDonald's cited a violation of company rules, specifically that the woman brought a stranger into the office, as the reason for her dismissal. Summers was also charged with unlawful imprisonment. Her colleague, Kim Dockery, was transferred to another restaurant. Collectively, the charges against Nix could have led to a 20-year prison sentence. In February 2006, he pleaded guilty to assault and unlawful imprisonment in exchange for a 5-year prison term. He claimed that he himself became a victim because he sincerely believed in following the police officer's orders, even when the orders became inhumane. During the trial, he apologized to Louise. Summers was sentenced to a year of probation, although the prosecutor insisted on actual imprisonment. He explained, "It didn't matter whether Summers thought she was dealing with a police officer or not. If the President of the United States ordered to take a girl's clothes and lock her in a room, there would be no justification for that. However, some leniency was shown towards her after Louise revealed that her manager had been deceived and she became another victim of the crime." The trial of Stewart began on October 24, 2006, following the court decisions in the cases of Nix and Summers so they could testify against him. Nix claimed in court that he simply followed Officer Scott's instructions. Donna asserted that she spoke with 3, as it seemed to her, different people and heard a police raid in the background. Moreover, Scott knew the names of several employees and a customer in the restaurant, claiming that the general manager of the establishment, Lisa, was on the other line, so Donna believed she was talking to a real police officer. Detective Stamp questioned how Stewart could know the names of the employees and customers. He replied that he did not know because investigators could never confirm these claims. The bombshell effect was produced by the testimony of Thomas Sims, a restaurant worker who put an end to the cruel prank. According to him, Louise said she would receive a substantial check as a result of what she went through. Thomas admitted that he never reported this statement to the police and only informed McDonald's management. Stewart's lawyers skillfully used this testimony to suggest that Louise staged the entire incident to demand compensation from McDonald's. The defense also argued that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence, and the discovered phone card was not the one used to make the call to McDonald's in Kentucky, Mount Washington. Furthermore, the fact that Stewart bought the card does not prove that he used it. On October 31st, the jury found Stewart not guilty and all charges were dropped. Despite this, the prosecutors were convinced that they caught the right person, as there were no calls from the prankster since his arrest. Louise filed a $200 million civil lawsuit against McDonald's, blaming the company for not informing employees about the prankster, even though the company knew about the prankster for at least 2 years. There were about 30 other calls to McDonald's, and 12 cases resulted in lawsuits in 4 different states. All these cases ended in out-of-court settlements. Louise's case was the only one that went to trial. The jury was given 12 possible verdict options. They deliberated for a long time and finally decided that part of the blame for what happened lay with the prankster and the other part was on McDonald's. They ruled that the company would pay Louise over $6 million. It later became known that the jury members took a long time to deliberate because they couldn't agree on the compensation amount for Louise. One juror wanted to give her $100 million, while another insisted on just $1. As a result of an unsuccessful appeal, McDonald's was obliged to pay an additional $2.4 million to cover legal expenses. Incredibly, Donna also filed a $50 million lawsuit against McDonald's, claiming that the management did not warn restaurant managers about the prankster. In response, McDonald's stated that they initially did not inform managers because they did not want them to refuse to cooperate with real police officers. However, a few days before the incident in Kentucky, they did send a voice message to managers with a warning. They also argued that the strip search went against their rules since 2001, something Summers should have known. The company's representatives blamed Summers and Nix for the incident, as well as Louise herself, noting that all three should have understood that the call was a prank. Nevertheless, the jury decided to award Donna over $1.1 million, although the amount was later reduced to $500,000. Louise never returned to work at McDonald's. The incident left an indelible mark on her, and she had to take a long time to recover from the cruel prank. She was too traumatized to attend college as she had planned. Nevertheless, she gradually began to recover. She found a job at a law firm, met a nice young man, and soon became a mother. After receiving compensation, she admitted that she would use the funds to study law since her initial plans to become a medical professional were shattered. You never know how you'll act until you find yourself in a specific situation. One might wonder what's wrong with Donna or Nix, but more than 60 people acted exactly like Donna Summers. Why do we so easily obey orders, even when we know they are wrong? Why are we willing to inflict pain on others if someone else takes responsibility for it? There are a couple of well-known experiments that explain how the prankster managed to turn people into his puppets. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted what is now known as the Milgram experiment on obedience in psychology. The professor told participants that he was studying the learning process, but in reality, he was studying people's willingness to obey authority figures. Participants were asked to administer electric shocks with increasing voltage to people who incorrectly answered questions. In reality, these people were actors who did not suffer from electric shocks. However, the experiment showed that over 65% of participants would administer the maximum voltage to an innocent learner just because a person in a white lab coat told them to. In 1971, Professor Philip Zimbardo conducted a similar experiment known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. He divided student volunteers into two groups, with some becoming prisoners and others guards. The professor studied the psychological effect of obtained power. The experiment had to be terminated after just 6 days because the students quickly immersed themselves in their roles, and the guards began to show aggression towards the prisoners. Professor Zimbardo later hired a consultant from one of the fast food restaurant chains who became a victim of the prankster. He concluded that the criminal had read Milgram's work because he applied basic techniques of gaining control over people. The caller presented himself as a person with authority. He insisted on being treated with pronounced respect, using such terms as "sir." The caller told people that he took full responsibility and all consequences of what was happening. In case of resistance, he told people that they had to continue because they had no other choice. A tangled love story unfolds like a dark detective tale, a crime film, a film noir, with a timeless plot where lust and obsession lead to murder and classic betrayal. This was Jaime's favorite genre, and he played the lead villain. Patricia helped dress him in the costume of a deranged, jealous man, work overalls, gloves, and a stocking mask. Then she, the true star of this film, brilliantly played the victim. Thirsting for authenticity, she cut her own hand and barricaded herself in the bathroom, clutching a real revolver in her bleeding hand to complete the authenticity of her fabricated image. All that was missing was a camera to focus on her wild eyes and feigned horror as she aimed the revolver and fired. On June 25, 2008, at 1:15 a.m., while the residents of Garden Valley, California were peacefully sleeping in their beds, the fire station received a report of a fire blazing along a winding road above a deep gorge. This is a challenging area with many sharp turns, hills, and ravines. Only upon getting closer did the firefighters notice that a burning SUV was at the center of the fire. Their experience told them that the body of the driver might be inside. Unfortunately, they were right. The body, like the entire vehicle, was completely engulfed in flames. Earlier that evening, a report had been made to the emergency services about a missing resident who had gone to buy propane in his Chevrolet Suburban and had not returned. The firefighters could see that the vehicle burning before them was indeed a Suburban. The missing man was 54-year-old Ron Presba. Around 9 p.m., he had left to buy propane for a barbecue and never returned. The remains found at the scene were sent for an autopsy, but officers were able to identify the burned vehicle, and it was indeed Ron's SUV. The news quickly spread throughout Garden Valley. Many people knew Ron personally and were saddened by the news. Initially, everything pointed to the man being the victim of a road accident. On such a rough road, there were many opportunities for a vehicle to go off into the ravine and catch fire. The propane Ron was carrying only added fuel to the blaze. Firefighters found 2 large pools of blood, each more than a meter in diameter, on the road. They speculated that the man had hit a deer, a large animal that could cause such a significant amount of blood. It was hard to imagine a worse place to encounter an animal, a dark, winding road above a deep ravine without any guardrails or barriers. Many people in such situations react by sharply turning the wheels. However, the firefighters could not find the body of the struck animal near the collision site. Moreover, upon closer inspection, the bloodstains looked strange. Between the larger pools of blood were smaller bloodstains, as if something was bleeding, then stopped, then started bleeding again. Nearby, there was a partial footprint and some sort of stain, as if a package or something similar had been lying there. Additionally, there were acceleration marks near the scene, indicating that someone had left the scene in a vehicle, and quickly. Considering these strange findings on the road, the fire investigator suspected that this was not an accident. The suspicions of the fire investigator were confirmed when he found a bag with a reddish liquid near the burned-out vehicle. At first, he mistook it for transmission fluid, but it was strangely covered in flies. Upon closer examination, to his horror, he realized that the bag contained hair, skull fragments, and brain matter. The bag had traces of fire, although the flames hadn't yet reached it. This meant that Ron's vehicle had been set on fire before it went off the ravine. It was likely stopped, set ablaze, and then pushed down the slope. The bag was thrown afterward. This was clearly done intentionally. At the coroner's office, it was confirmed that the victim was Ron Presba. The blood on the road and in the bag also belonged to him. Ron had been murdered, and the fire was used to cover up the crime. Police investigators began their work, and the morning after the body was discovered, they spoke with the victim's wife, Patricia, or Patty. Patty seemed overwhelmed with grief, but was eager to help the police. She said that Ron had no enemies. In fact, someone like him couldn't have had enemies. He was one of the pillars of the Garden Valley community. Everyone saw him as a loving father, devoted husband, very honest, hardworking, reliable, and an all-around wonderful person. Ron would give you the shirt off his back to help someone. He had spent many years building his trucking company before he met Patty. Patty worked for the California Conservation Corps and was part of a program that taught young people who would otherwise get into trouble with the law useful labor skills in firefighting, forest protection, and conservation. It was essentially a work camp for troubled youth. Both Patty and Ron had adult children from previous relationships. The day before, at 4:30 p.m., Patty had gone to visit her daughter and grandchildren who lived an hour away. She called her husband around 9 p.m., and he mentioned that he was going to get propane for the barbecue. However, when she returned at midnight, the house was empty. Ron's daughters told the police that a guest had been staying with the family in recent weeks. This guest was 21-year-old Jaime Ramos. Detectives returned to the family home to speak with Patty again. She confirmed that Jaime Ramos had been living with the family for 3 weeks. He was one of the troubled young people assisted by the California Conservation Corps, and Patty had been his mentor. Jaime Ramos had joined the program a year ago after being charged with assault. Patty and Ron decided to help the young man save money so he could visit his relatives in Texas. Patty described Jaime as a nice guy who had faced many challenges since childhood. His mother had taken her own life when he was just 2 years old. His father was in and out of his life, and after being passed around by various relatives, he eventually went to live with his grandmother, who became like a mother to him. Now Patty had taken on the role of his mentor and friend, and Jaime often sought her advice. She explained that Jaime was finishing his training program at the center, but needed a place to stay for the remaining month. Patty had asked Ron if Jaime could stay in their spare bedroom, and Ron, being a kind-hearted person, agreed. Ron welcomed Jaime into their home, and they developed a strong bond, with Ron becoming like a father figure to Jaime. However, just the day before, Jaime had left. They had lent him some money so he could travel to his relatives in Texas. Jaime's sudden departure seemed suspicious, especially since Patty claimed she didn't know how to contact him. In other words, they had lent the young man money, but she had no way to reach him. Before the detectives could ask Patty further questions, something caught their eye. A few drops of blood by the fireplace caught the detectives' attention. Although there weren't many, they deemed it important and called in the forensic team. Upon their arrival, they processed the room with luminol, causing it to light up with traces of blood that someone had attempted to clean. The detectives realized they had stumbled upon the murder scene. Since Patty had an alibi, Jaime seemed the most likely suspect. However, according to Patty, she and Ron had a good relationship with Jaime. Nevertheless, the detectives reached out to Jaime's family in Texas, who said he was still en route but provided his phone number. Over the phone, Jaime confirmed that Ron had become a true friend and mentor to him in a short period. He expressed his desire to help the police uncover the truth about Ron's death. Strangely, though, he refused to disclose his whereabouts. Since Jaime was using a prepaid phone, the police couldn't trace his location. Instead, they tried to gain his trust, encouraging Jaime to keep calling them and persuade him to reveal what he knew about Ron's death. Meanwhile, Curtis Edwards reached out to them. Curtis was also a member of the program helping young people, just like Jaime. Moreover, Jaime was his roommate. Therefore, he knew something that, in his opinion, no one else suspected. Jaime and Patty were having a romance. Curtis was shocked. All the young people in the organization loved Patty, calling her Mom, but Jaime clearly had feelings for her of a different nature. Despite being 21 years old, while she was 47, he was younger than her children. Nonetheless, Jaime asked Curtis not to tell anyone about it. As his friend, Curtis agreed, but now he felt obligated to inform the police. The meeting with the detectives was brief, but its importance for the investigation couldn't be underestimated. Because now the investigators knew that Jaime could have a motive for Ron's murder, it was worth talking to Patty again, because it became clear that she knew more than she was saying. Patty reluctantly admitted that she had been involved with Jaime, but a couple of days before Ron's murder, she ended things with her lover because his behavior was increasingly alarming her. When she brought up the breakup, they were in the car, and Jaime swerved the car as if he wanted to crash into an oncoming vehicle. Fortunately, they avoided the accident, but Patty realized he was willing to do anything just to be with her. At some point, Ron realized that his wife was having an affair, but he reacted as a very understanding person. Ron and Patty agreed to buy Jaime a car so he could go to Texas and stop being part of their lives. Patty and Jaime went to a car dealership to choose a car. Patty told the detectives that they bought the car, packed his things into it, and sent him off to Texas. And this happened just before Ron's murder. Now, however, she was afraid that Jaime would come back to finish what he started, to kill her. However, after reviewing the surveillance camera footage at the dealership, detectives found out that the love affair hadn't ended because Patty and Jaime were holding hands and hugging each other affectionately. But before the investigators could summon the woman for a candid conversation, a new twist emerged in the case. Patty disappeared. A month to the day after Ron's murder, the detectives drove back to the same house. Again, they approached the front door, crossed the threshold once more. The feeling of déjà vu never left them, especially when they saw that the small house had become the scene of another bloody crime. Blood was everywhere, in the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, even on the doorstep. Chairs were overturned, rugs were displaced as if something had been dragged across the floor. A bloodied kitchen knife lay on the TV stand. The air was thick with the smell of blood, and the bathroom door was broken with bullet holes in it. Everything seemed unreal, like a stage set. Amidst this gruesome scene, the detectives found a note made from cut-out magazine letters. They had never seen such notes before, except in movies. It stated that Patty had been kidnapped, exactly what Patty had feared Jaime would do. The police began their search for the woman and distributed her description to officers. The next day, July 25, 2008, hundreds of kilometers away from the Presba family home in Salt Lake City, Utah, a patrol officer was checking the registration numbers of cars in a motel parking lot when he noticed a green Hyundai. A quick check revealed that the car was linked to a murder investigation. The officer contacted detectives from California who informed him that two people were associated with this car. Jaime Ramos and Patricia Presba. Approximately 5 minutes later, the door of the motel room opened and a woman came out. She walked straight to the police officer. He aimed his weapon at her, but the woman stated that she was Patricia Presba, and she added, "He's in the room, he's been shot." The policeman didn't know what to think and couldn't imagine what he would see when he entered that door. He and his partner burst open the door and shouted, "Police!" But there was no response. Someone was clearly lying on the bed. The policeman demanded that the person raise their hands and come out, but the person didn't move. The officer thought the person under the blanket was dead. He grabbed the blanket and saw that there was a wounded person there. It was Jaime Ramos. He looked at the policeman and said, raising his hands, "Don't shoot. They've already shot me." Both Patricia and Jaime were taken into custody. While Jaime received medical attention, detectives questioned Patricia. Patty claimed that she also became a victim of Jaime. She recounted that she was sleeping in her bed when suddenly she was grabbed by a man wearing a mask made from a stocking, gloves, and a jumpsuit. She managed to break free, but he lunged at her again. They struggled, wreaking havoc around them. It was only when he dragged her into the kitchen that she realized it was Jaime, although she had never seen him like that before. He confessed to her that he had killed her husband, and she would be next. At one point, Jaime attempted to strike her with a large kitchen knife, slashing her hand as she tried to shield herself. However, she managed to reach the bedroom, grabbed a .44 Magnum revolver, and locked herself in the bathroom. Jaime smashed the door, and that's when she fired 3 times. Dropping the weapon, she ran outside, but even after she shot him 3 times with the Magnum, Jaime caught up with her and seized her. Now he had the gun, and he ordered her to get into his car. They stopped several times along the way, notably to refuel. Detectives puzzled over why she didn't escape from the wounded man while he was refueling the car. Patty replied that she was terrified. What happened next was known to the police. Here, the story could have ended, and Patty would have appeared a heroine if Jaime had died from the gunshot wounds. He was indeed close to death when they found him in the hotel, but he received timely medical attention and he was ready to talk to the police. When at the age of 21, Jaime was admitted to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he was given a job, he felt like he had hit the jackpot. He quickly befriended other members of the organization, particularly his roommate Curtis, as well as his supervisor Patty. Initially, he regarded her as a friend and mentor, but soon their relationship became much closer. She didn't immediately confess to Jaime that she was married. Even more so, she didn't tell him how 6 years ago she had to work hard to make Ron fall in love with her when her third husband left her. But she told him that she was living in an unhappy marriage. Jaime's heartstrings were deeply touched by Patty's confessions. The thing was, he himself had been tormented by a male relative for years. It started when he was 6. It started when he was 6 years old, ended at 16, and occurred once or twice a month. Jaime asked Patty to leave her husband, but she always found some excuse why it was impossible. Then she mentioned another option. At first it was like a game, a joke. The woman said, "Do you want me to leave him? What if something unfortunate happens to him?" "Which we arrange?" Jaime asked incredulously. "What else?" Patty initiated conversations about how Ron liked to work around the house and might fall from a ladder onto something sharp or get hit by a car. It seemed like a joke until she showed her lover an envelope with insurance. And then he realized that everything they talked about was serious. She convinced him that after receiving the money, they could start over. Jaime would go to college first and they would live together. She took out insurance on her husband and was supposed to receive $150,000 in case of his death. But if his death occurred as a result of an accident, the wife would receive $300,000. This is called double insurance. Double Insurance is also the name of a true classic of cinema, a film in which a woman seduces a man and persuades him to kill her husband, and then the seductress shoots the naive lover. Jaime hadn't watched that movie, but Patty clearly understood its essence. Or Oscar Wilde was right, and life ultimately does imitate art. But Jaime had no intention of becoming a murderer, and Patty started pressing him. "Don't you believe me? Don't you believe that he's tormenting me, beating me? Don't you want to live with me?" She didn't leave the man infatuated with her any other choice, so he set her a condition. He had to personally see what Ron was really like. The woman agreed. She told her husband that a guy at work insulted her, but Jaime stood up for her, beat him, and therefore he was expelled from the program. Now he had nowhere to live. Ron, being a kind soul, of course, offered the guy to stay with them. He personally went for Jaime, brought him home, and thanked him for standing up for his wife. He said that Jaime could live with them for free and only asked him to help around the house, because what the guy did for him was already enough payment. So Jaime started living with his mistress and her husband. Ron behaved friendly, taught him how to use various tools, and in general treated the guy like a son. But Jaime was most concerned that Ron never raised his voice to his wife, never scolded her, never refused her anything, and it clearly wasn't a show for the public. Doubts began to creep into his mind. Patty described a monster, but Jaime saw a completely different Ron. However, Patty wasn't about to back down. She skillfully manipulated the guy, convincing him that he was saving her from a cruel husband, and set a date for when Jaime would have to attack Ron. Otherwise, he would have to leave and never see her again. The thought of this was unbearable for Jaime. Tuesday, June 24th came, one of the longest days of the year. That evening, Ron sat calmly in his armchair by the fireplace watching TV. Patty had indeed gone to her daughter's, but she kept calling her lover, asking if he had finished with her husband yet and why he was taking so long. She insisted that it would be easier to cover up the evidence if it happened outside, so Jaime told Ron that he heard some noise in the pen with his pigs. Ron, of course, believed him and went to check, but Jaime couldn't bring himself to attack the man. When Ron returned home, he sat back in his favorite armchair. Jaime sat on a chair in the kitchen 3 meters away from him and drank a lot of water, as if delaying what he was about to do, trying to calm down. Patty continued to call, asking when everything would be over. Jaime saw the hammer and decided that if one blow to the head rendered Ron unconscious, it would be enough for him. He took one last sip of water, put on gloves, wiped the hammer. The house was so small. Ron was so close. Jaime told himself, "You're doing everything right." He thought about the violence against Patty, remembered how he himself had been abused, and the anger from the flooding memories allowed him to feel a sharp adrenaline rush. He literally jumped up from the chair, ran to Ron, and struck the man 3 times quickly on the head. Ron barely had time to scream, "Why?" But Jaime seemed to snap. He shouted, "How dare you torment my wife? Yes, Patty is my wife now. How dare you hit her?" He struck the man 3 more times, smashing his skull. Then he dropped the hammer. Amazingly, he felt relieved, knowing that he did it for her. But to do everything as she wanted, the killer had to take the body out of the house and create the appearance of an accident. To put Ron in the driver's seat, he had to build a mini-trap from the ladder and plywood. After that, Jaime sat next to the deceased and directed the car towards the cliff, sitting next to the bloodied man whose head he had just smashed. To distract himself from such a reality, he remembered the movie Sin City. There's a scene where a killer drives down a deserted road with a corpse sitting next to him. But when Jaime watched that movie 3 years ago, he couldn't have imagined he would do something similar. On the way, he threw away Ron's chair, the bloodied carpet, and the hammer. Then at the canyon, he used all the props to prepare the final scene of the accident. He doused the car with gasoline, prepared a propane tank, put the man's foot on the gas pedal, flicked his lighter. It was at that moment that the blood flowing from the car spilled onto the road and created a puddle. Jaime set fire to the SUV and rolled the car down. He noticed a packet. Cleaning up at home, he collected pieces of brain in a packet, and now it fell out of the car. Jaime threw it into the ditch, thinking the fire would destroy it. Then he ran to his car, waiting for him at the cliff, and wanted to drive to Texas, but he couldn't. He had to see her. When he entered the house, Patty was washing her husband's blood in the living room. And right where Ron had been killed a few hours earlier, Patty's 3-year-old granddaughter sat watching cartoons on TV. Patty flew into a rage when she saw him. Jaime asked to hug him goodbye. Patty reluctantly complied, and he finally left. On the way, alone with his thoughts, he began to realize what he had done. He felt very ashamed and sick. Jaime was supposed to go to Texas to be with his relatives, but when the police didn't believe in the accident and began investigating the murder, Patty became nervous. She ordered him to go somewhere they wouldn't find him. Her anxiety multiplied when a month later, Jaime told her he was returning to California. The investigators had traced him back to his grandmother, the woman who raised him and whom he obeyed unquestioningly. She told her grandson that he shouldn't behave as if he were guilty of something and returned to California to talk to the police. Jaime agreed, but on his way back, despite his grandmother's and the investigators' advice, he called Patty. Apparently, that's when Patty realized that he was becoming a problem, and it was time to abandon him to save herself. She listened to Jaime and replied that she had a plan that would allow them to spend the rest of their lives together. Wasn't this what he had always dreamed of? She wanted to make it seem as if Jaime had abducted her. He agreed, thinking they would leave together and lie low for a while. Patty ordered her lover to overturn all the furniture in her house and knock down the bathroom door to make the abduction look more realistic. But she didn't warn him that she would be hiding behind it with a magnum. And as soon as he broke the door, she shot. Once, twice, thrice. She hit his hand, leg, and clavicle area. Jaime was in shock, asking, "How could you do this?" The woman calmly approached and pressed the gun to his head, but the gun didn't fire. While Jaime lay on the floor in blood, she went to another room, tried to fix the gun, but changed her mind and left. For some reason, Jaime decided to follow her. Even more unbelievably, Patty said to him, "Okay, let's go." And they left the state together. The next day, Jaime's car was spotted at a motel in Salt Lake City, and the couple was taken into custody. But Patty wasn't done yet. She still had one last hope, to convince Jaime to take the blame. But how could she do that? Before the trial, Patty and Jaime were held in a small jail together, and the plumbing arrangement of the prison allowed Patty to once again get into the heart and soul of her young lover. If you simultaneously flush the water in the female and male toilets, you can talk as if you are in the same room. Most likely, Patty wasn't the first to discover this, but she cleverly took advantage of this peculiarity, persuading Jaime to stick to her version. Allegedly, at first, she also wished for her husband's death, but changed her mind, and then Jaime killed Ron and abducted her, trying to get rid of the only witness. Remarkably, Jaime was willing to go along with this for her sake. However, when the boy's lawyer learned about it, he intervened and shuffled the cards for Patty. He contacted the only person who could break the spell over the woman, Jaime's grandmother. The grandmother and the beloved aunts of the young man ordered him to tell the whole truth. In the interrogation room, the investigators witnessed the power Patty had over Jaime. Despite her confession and everything she had done, Jaime begged for the opportunity to see her. In June 2009, the preliminary hearing began. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Jaime was not the only one whom Patty had tried to persuade to commit murder. Her friend took the witness stand and told that Patty had asked her if she knew anyone who could go for this crime. But even stranger was that she once wanted to kill her ex-husband and then asked the ex-husband if he would kill Ron. On June 29, 2009, Jaime pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patty. But he did not get such an opportunity. Just a couple of days before the start of the trial in February 2010, she also admitted guilt. She was sentenced to imprisonment from 42 years to life for Ron's murder and attempted murder of Jaime. Jaime was sentenced from 25 years to life. Just before starting his sentence, Jaime met with Ron's 2 daughters and told them that he was a wonderful person. He treated him kindly, and Jaime also managed to love him for the short time he knew him. Yet despite what his own eyes had seen, Jaime chose to believe Patty. She chose an impressionable, vulnerable boy who was not loved in childhood, got into his soul, and made him do what she needed. Eliza Levy was young, worked a lot, and loved adventure. She had her whole life ahead of her, but suddenly she was kidnapped by strangers. They took her deep into the forest, tied her to a tree, and threatened to brutally harm her and her family if she didn't obey. Her relatives were beside themselves with worry. An elite group of police agents got involved. But could Eliza do something herself to escape? Using an unusual tool, she put a risky plan into action. Then, one night in the dark, she noticed some lights. Was this the end of the nightmare? Or would it start again with renewed force? The 24-year-old Eliza Levy can be called a child of 2 worlds. Her father, James Levy, was an American born and raised on Long Island, just a few miles from New York City, while her mother, Alicia Ortiz, worked as a school teacher in Ecuador. They fell in love when James was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1980s and soon married. Of their 4 children, 2 received dual citizenship in both the U.S. and Ecuador. James believed that raising their children in the U.S. was best, but he unexpectedly found them drawn to the peaceful, slow-paced life of South America. So the couple built a home in the middle of the Ecuadorian jungle, just across the border from Colombia. Together, they founded the organization Al Tropico to protect the invaluable tropical forest surrounding them. Eliza, the eldest of the 2, adored life in the wilderness. Her adventurous spirit kept her constantly on the move, always ready to search for new bird species, or explore uncharted territory. When she returned to Ecuador, she enrolled in university, where she studied botany and biology. It was here that she found a serious passion: cycling. She organized weekly races through the streets of Quito and took long trips across the country. Her other passion became Al Tropico, the group founded by her father. She volunteered, guiding school children through the jungle, teaching them to identify hundreds of species of local birds. The dense jungles of Ecuador are home to many plants and birds, but they also provide the perfect hideout for criminals. And the country's northern border is notorious for its security problems. Illegal militarized Colombian organizations smuggle contraband and prohibited substances into Ecuador, and often use small villages on the Ecuadorian side as refueling stations. In 2009, the most infamous of these organizations was FARC, Colombia's left-wing extremist guerrilla group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was FARC that held politician Ingrid Betancourt hostage in the jungle for 6 years, a story that spread across the world. However, when you grow up in a region, even one as troubled as this, life from the inside often feels completely different. This is why Eliza never felt unsafe in any part of Ecuador. And it was precisely for this reason that she suspected nothing when a man called her, explaining that he was from her hometown and, as an official, wanted to launch a new bird research project in another city near the Colombian border. Eliza agreed to meet him to discuss the details, as long as he sent a driver to pick her up. They settled on that arrangement. On Saturday, October 17, 2009, one of Eliza's brothers dropped her off at the meeting spot with the driver of an Isuzu Trooper. Eliza got into the SUV, but before doing so, she asked her brother to write down the vehicle's license plate number just in case. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver was calm and friendly, but an hour into the drive, he picked up 2 strangers, claiming they needed a ride. In reality, they had other plans. The men pressed the barrel of a gun to Eliza's neck and demanded that she stay quiet. The strangers were driving Eliza to an unknown destination, but her family in Quito had no idea. The last they'd heard was that she was heading to a meeting about tropical birds. When she didn't return to the city as expected and failed to call, they became worried. Even then, they didn't think the worst, assuming instead that a mudslide, a fairly common occurrence in Ecuador, might have delayed her. At the time, Eliza's father, James, was in San Francisco attending an environmental conference. The family didn't want to alarm him, but after 2 days of growing panic, they sent him a message. On Monday, October 19, 2009, 2 days after Eliza's disappearance, her mother, Alicia, received a call from a stranger. He told her not to worry, that Eliza was fine and with them in Colombia. The caller made it clear that Eliza had been kidnapped, but was in no rush to make demands. Eliza's father caught the next flight back to Ecuador. At first, the Levy family hoped to resolve the situation without involving the police. The question they faced wouldn't have crossed the mind of someone from any other country. Was it even worth calling the authorities? In Ecuador, not everyone trusts the police. Even in the case of a serious crime like kidnapping, some Ecuadorians try to solve the problem on their own. But there was another option. Ecuador's police force has an elite unit specifically for dealing with kidnappings known as UNAS. This unit, made up of 100 specially trained agents, is tasked with tracking down kidnappers and helping families through the harrowing ordeal of a loved one being abducted. They assist with negotiations, ransom discussions, and, when possible, organize rescue operations. The Levy family contacted UNAS. It's worth noting that while kidnapping an American in Ecuador is not unheard of, it is usually a less dangerous scenario, where a tourist is held in a taxi for a few hours and forced to withdraw cash from an ATM. This time, however, the situation was far more serious. The most terrifying possibility was if the kidnappers had ties to FARC, the Colombian guerrilla group. In that case, Eliza could be taken deep into the jungle and held for years. Given this, the UNAS specialists advised the family to also contact the U.S. Embassy in Quito. On the morning of Wednesday, October 21st, 4 days after the kidnapping, FBI agents, UNAS officers, and other agents arrived at the Levy home. They promised to try to track down the kidnappers, but they emphasized that the most critical and delicate task in securing Eliza's release would be communication with the criminals. The leader of the kidnappers had left Eliza's mother with a phone number, but who would have the courage to call him? The agents decided that Eliza's father, James Levy, who was known by the Spanish version of his name, Jamie, was capable of handling the delicate task of communicating with the kidnappers, with the agent's guidance, of course. They handed him a sheet with potential phrases the kidnappers might use and how he should respond. After a brief briefing, James made the call to the leader of the kidnapping gang. He had to ask his wife to leave the room to avoid breaking down in front of her. The conversation lasted 4.5 minutes, and the kidnappers didn't allow James to speak with his daughter, claiming she wasn't with them. However, the most important information they gave him was that Eliza had been kidnapped for ransom, and they would later reveal the amount. James held himself together remarkably well during the call, but that evening after the agents left, he locked himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey and broke down in tears. He was overwhelmed with guilt, blaming himself for what had happened. For years, he had worked with various organizations and groups on both sides of the Ecuador-Colombia border, and he had arrogantly believed that his family was safe from harm. At the same time, Eliza was being held in a remote area of Ecuador, less than 200 miles from her family. She had no way of knowing that they were fighting for her release. All she knew was that the past few days had been the most painful, disorienting, and terrifying of her life. After the strangers jumped into the SUV, they pressed a gun to her neck and promised that nothing would happen to her as long as she behaved sensibly. They threw a towel over her head, cuffed her hands, and gagged her. Then they dragged her from the front passenger seat to the back, laying her on the floor. One of the men moved to the front while another stayed in the back to guard her. Eliza didn't even think about resisting. Everything had happened so fast that she hadn't fully realized she had been kidnapped. It felt like a dream, but it was a nightmare she couldn't wake from. They drove off-road for over an hour, bouncing along rough terrain. Then, the vehicle came to a sudden stop. The door opened. She heard someone approach. A man told her to get out and walk with them. Eliza recognized his voice. It was the man who had arranged the meeting about tropical birds. They led her somewhere to what she sensed was an even more dangerous and isolated place. From the moment she fell into the hands of her captors, Eliza resolved to remain calm and alert. She knew that one wrong move could cost her life. When the captors finally removed the blanket from her head, Eliza saw that they were heavily armed, their faces concealed by ski masks. They told her they were part of a paramilitary group and that the threat extended not only to her, but also to her family in Quito. They claimed they had stationed people around her family's home and warned that if she made any foolish moves, her family would suffer. The men asked if she had a GPS chip implanted under her skin, a measure that wealthy individuals in Latin America sometimes take to track their location in case of kidnapping. That's when Eliza realized that the gang believed she came from a wealthy family. She assured them this wasn't the case, but the men were convinced that her American father would pay a large ransom for her. After that, they forced her to record a message on a phone for her parents. She spoke under their direction. "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. Just do what they say and don't talk to the police." She tried to speak calmly, knowing that her mother would be terrified beyond words. The men then took her phone, watch, and tablet from her backpack, but left her with a change of clothes, a book, and something else she wouldn't remember until much later. They chained her to a tree, next to which they had hastily set up an improvised tent. Under the guidance of the agents, Eliza's father, James, negotiated with the kidnappers regarding the ransom. He knew that kidnappings were common in Ecuador, but he had always believed his family wouldn't be affected, as they didn't have the money to make them targets. However, in a country where being an American often equates to being seen as wealthy, his worst fears were confirmed when the leader of the gang valued Eliza's life at $1 million. Following the agent's instructions, James told the kidnappers that he wouldn't even consider paying a ransom until he was certain his daughter was alive. Although the criminals had forced Eliza to record a message for her parents, they never sent it. So James asked questions only Eliza could answer, such as the names of her grandmother and godfather. When they received the correct responses, the family was finally assured that Eliza was alive. The urgent issue then became how to raise the money. Despite the U.S. Embassy providing every possible support to the family, they were unable to offer the ransom. If the embassy were to pay $1 million for every kidnapped American, it would set a dangerous precedent. Essentially, the family only had their house, and the bank agreed to loan them $80,000 with the home as collateral. In desperation, James called his relatives in New York, and his brother and sister decided to give him all the money they had saved for retirement. James and his wife planned to sell the house afterward to repay their siblings. James informed the kidnapper that the maximum they could gather was $150,000, but the captors insisted the ransom should be closer to $1 million. With each conversation becoming shorter and more tense, the agents knew time was running out. They hurriedly began surveillance on known criminals in the region who could be suspects. Meanwhile, the family had no idea what Eliza had already endured or what lay ahead for her. By this point, she had spent 2 weeks chained to a tree, only able to move as far as the chain would allow. Exhausted and with limited mobility, she fought to stay strong, but it was becoming harder to battle her fears. Nighttime was her only solace, when she imagined she could hear her mother's voice. She found comfort in this imagined whisper, and, though she had never been particularly religious, she began to pray. Of course, Eliza had no idea that U.S. and Ecuadorian agents were hunting her kidnappers, let alone that Colombian specialists had joined the investigation. Colombians have extensive experience dealing with kidnappings, and their assistance proved invaluable. They provided high-tech equipment to track the leader of the gang's mobile phone. Naturally, there was no guarantee that he was in the same location as Eliza, but investigators had other leads to follow. The most useful lead came from Eliza herself when she asked her brother to record the SUV's license plate number. Investigators matched this number with those of vehicles captured by surveillance cameras at toll booths. They identified the vehicle used by the kidnappers, which had passed through several toll booths and was heading towards the Colombian border. During her captivity, Eliza interacted only with the 2 guards who watched over her. The leader of the gang would come and go, staying in a cabin about 50 yards from her tent, and she rarely saw him directly. The 2 guards played the classic roles of good cop and bad cop. The guard Eliza privately referred to as the good guy would bring her rice and beans and assured her that she would be released soon. In contrast, the other guard, the bad guy, threatened to kill her and her family. He also menaced that he might sell her to a larger, more dangerous group. Eliza understood that he meant FARC, an even more brutal gang experienced in holding hostages. While she was terrified, she cried alone, unwilling to show weakness to her captors, especially the one who was threatening her. It took a lot of willpower, but Eliza gradually managed to overcome her fear. She daydreamed about riding her bike, feeling free. Deciding to take action, she tried to gain the favor of the good guy guard. Indeed, he began talking to her more frequently during meals and even brought her yarn and knitting needles. She knitted 4 scarves for him, hoping to learn more about her family in exchange. He told her that her parents were alive and negotiating for her release. However, her hope was quickly dashed when the other guard openly threatened to cut off one of her fingers to increase the pressure on her parents. After 18 days of captivity, Eliza could no longer simply sit and wait for rescue. There were times when the 2 guards would wander far enough from her tent that she was only held back by a chain with a small lock. The knitting needles they had given her were too big to be of any use, but she wondered if she could find something to break the lock. Her desperation sparked creativity. The kidnappers had taken all her gadgets but left her backpack. At the bottom of the bag, she found some bobby pins. Eliza took 2 pins, bent them, and began to pick at the lock, as she had seen in movies. For the next 3 days, whenever the guards were out of sight, she worked on the lock. She tried over and over again until one day it finally clicked open. With incredible willpower, she managed to stay calm. One of the guards seemed ruthless enough to shoot her if she tried to escape, so she climbed nearby trees to get a sense of her surroundings, trying to see if there was any visible path or if the jungle was too impenetrable. Then she would return, sit down, and relock the chain. Eliza was terrified of being caught. With each attempt, she grew bolder. She had resolved to take the risk and escape from her captors. She closed her eyes, praying for guidance from her mother. At that moment, she thought she heard her mother's voice saying, "Don't risk it, don't run, wait 2 days." Eliza decided to heed the advice and wait, though not for long, as she noticed the guards' growing tension. Her time was running out. Eliza had been independent and comfortable in nature since childhood, and now she used those qualities to keep her mind occupied. She spent hours watching the trees, trying to identify the birds by their colors and songs. During the day, she reread the only book she had with her, a Colombian romance novel. But then the night would come again. The chains around her ankles prevented her from sleeping more than an hour or two at a time, and every rustle in the jungle could signal new danger. On the night of Saturday, November 7th, she suddenly woke up in the middle of the night and distinctly heard some sounds and saw the lights of flashlights. In the dim light, Eliza could only make out silhouettes. There were many of them, and they carried military-grade weapons. The silhouettes moved hurriedly. Eliza feared that these were FARC members. She imagined she might spend years with this group in the Colombian jungle. As the lights and shadows approached her tent, one of the men leaned in. He said something, but she couldn't hear him over her cries and pleas not to take her away. He then said that they were police officers, that they knew her father Jamie, and that they had come to rescue her. When Eliza heard her father's name, a wave of joy washed over her. She could only hope this was not a dream. The officers covered her with a bulletproof blanket and stayed with her while they conducted the operation to capture the armed kidnappers. When UNAC officers called the Levy family to inform them of Eliza's rescue, her mother, Alicia, answered the phone. Suddenly, she began to scream and jump for joy. The family describes this as the best moment of their lives, as if they could breathe freely again. They had to wait a few more hours to learn that Eliza was unharmed and safe. NAS officers brought Eliza back to Quito. Although she was eager to reunite with her family, the UNASE officials had other plans. They wanted to highlight the successful operation to rescue the hostage and encourage other families to seek police assistance without fear. To publicly showcase the moment of reunion, they held a brief press conference before introducing Eliza to her parents. After 3 weeks of anxious prayers and waiting, her family finally embraced her. As for the kidnappers, they turned out to be ordinary criminals rather than a militarized group. Eliza's testimony helped to charge the leader of the gang and the guard who had been kind to her, while the second guard managed to escape. Despite spending 3 weeks in a tiny tent, Eliza tried to maintain a positive outlook on her experience, particularly appreciating the beautiful forest that surrounded her. While no one would wish to spend 21 days in the jungle, she found it far better than being confined in a small, dark room. Her positive attitude helped her recover quickly, and she eventually became a source of strength for her family. Remarkably, just 8 weeks after returning home, Eliza embarked on a cycling trip across South America. She traveled 4,000 miles, and the local press covered her journey. She claims that the sense of freedom she experienced while cycling made the trip a healing experience for her. A woman walking or running alone on a trail. This image is often associated with a dense forest, where a thin, winding path leads deeper into it, and rays of light barely penetrate through the thick tree canopy. It's a place where an unsuspecting victim could be dragged off the trail, and nobody would hear her scream. But what if it's a sun-drenched, highly popular pathway located right in the heart of the city, where people stroll almost at any time? The attack on Katie Lorac happened precisely in such a wonderfully safe place. And that's the scariest part, because it confirms that a nightmare can become a reality in an instant, and something like this could happen to any one of us. Kathleen Louise Ayello Lorac, known as Katie, was born in New Mexico but grew up in California, where she met her future husband, Jeffrey Lyon. The young couple got married and they had 3 children, but despite 20 years together, the family eventually fell apart. Their divorce was a challenging process and was officially finalized in 1997. However, it turned out to be beneficial for the 44-year-old woman. Her friend recalls that Katie had always been a lively person, but after the divorce, she simply blossomed. Over the next 3 years, Katie advanced in her career, working as an assistant in Sistren Donner in Concord, California. It was a very successful and prominent company, and Katie held a high position in the office. A new, wonderful chapter began in her life. Her children were almost grown, she loved her job, and she started dating again. Despite being over 40, due to her excellent physical condition, grooming, and joyful attitude toward life, she attracted a lot of attention. At work, Katie introduced her son to one of her colleagues. The man's name was Johannes Lorac. There was an instant spark between them, and with Johannes, Katie felt she could be herself. They started dating, although their meetings were not very frequent because Johannes lived in Austria. However, they traveled together, had romantic weekends, and enjoyed skiing. In 2003, during a trip to a lake in Switzerland where they had gone for a skiing excursion, Johannes knelt down and asked Katie to marry him. She would have been happy to spend the rest of her life with Johannes, and just a few weeks later he came to the United States and they got married. The couple planned to live in Austria. After all, there was nothing truly tying the woman to the States. Her sons and daughter had grown up and supported her new relationship. Everyone who knew Katie wanted her to be happy, and it seemed like everything was heading that way in her marriage to Johannes. Meanwhile, Katie worked her last few weeks at the company, where her colleagues had practically become her family members. She was always ready to help her colleagues, genuinely concerned about each one of them, and was highly appreciated for it. However, no matter how open and caring Katie was, even she needed a breather. Her respite became the daily walks along a trail that started behind the parking lot of her office. During every lunch break, she would put on comfortable sport shoes and stroll along a trail slightly over 20 kilometers long. The Contra Costa Canal Trail passes through several residential neighborhoods, offices, and is surrounded by moderately dense but perfectly suitable greenery for walks. Besides enjoying the fresh air, Katie valued this time because she could make personal calls, especially to her husband. In Austria, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening, making it comfortable for the spouses to communicate. So, on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, colleagues saw Katie as usual at 12:40 p.m. She kicked off her office shoes, put on her sneakers, and left the office, just as she did every weekday. One might think that taking a solitary walk along a trail amidst shrubbery could be risky for an attractive woman, and in case of any danger, nobody would hear her scream. But this specific trail was nothing like that. Not only did it pass by residential homes and businesses, but people were constantly walking, jogging, walking dogs, and biking along it. It was nearly impossible to find a time during midday when the trail was deserted, yet someone managed to do so. Katie was deeply engaged in a conversation with her husband when he heard her either muffle a scream or sharply inhale before the phone disconnected. Johannes tried calling his wife back, assuming she might have simply stumbled and dropped her phone, but all calls went to voicemail. He knew Katie would call back, understanding that her abrupt end to the conversation might worry him, so he called her office to alert her colleagues. By that time, they were already concerned. Katie was punctual to the minute, and when she didn't return after lunch, they began searching for her. Johannes's call further troubled them. They knew what needed to be done. It was around 3 p.m. when the police were notified of Katie Lorac's disappearance. Credit must be given to the police. They didn't take the disappearance of an adult woman lightly and responded promptly. Just a few minutes after the call to the police, they dispatched officers to the trail since colleagues mentioned she should be there. The officers searched for her on foot, on motorcycles, and called in K9 units. The dog indeed led the K9 unit in the same direction the missing woman used to enjoy walking, so the officers knew they were on the right track. But how could she simply vanish in broad daylight? The search quickly led the K9 unit to a bloody trail on the pathway. It wasn't just a few drops, it was a very distinct trail, as if an injured person had been dragged from the trail into the bushes, but that wasn't all they found. A sneaker caught their eye, lying nearby in a pool of blood. Then they saw the body of a woman lying in the mud. She was in a small depression, covered in blood, her hair matted with it. She was naked, with a bra featuring an animal print lying on the grass nearby, along with black leggings, another sneaker, and a jacket. It seemed as though someone had forcibly removed items of clothing from the victim in a hurried manner. It was evident to the officers that the attack had turned violent, a brutal assault on an unprotected woman. Police immediately checked for signs of life in Katie, and despite all the injuries, it turned out she was still alive. The arriving paramedics swiftly transported her to the nearest hospital within minutes. Her condition was extremely fragile, and they were determined to help her. But at 4:54 p.m., they were compelled to pronounce Katie Lorac deceased. Once Katie was taken to the hospital, the forensic specialists aimed to preserve as much evidence as possible, but it was already too late. When it was discovered that Katie was still alive, the medical team worked urgently to save her life, and therefore, they couldn't act cautiously to preserve evidence. They cannot be blamed. It's essential to prioritize saving the life of the victim in such cases. Consequently, some evidence was compromised. However, the police almost immediately discovered something crucial: the weapon used in the crime. It turned out to be a part of a fence post. It was taken from the section of the barrier that had long been rusted. They surmised that whoever the perpetrator was, they had broken off a part of the post just before the attack. Perhaps the crime was impulsive rather than planned. Therefore, nobody paid attention to the strange object in the assailant's hands as it seemed harmless. While Katie was on the phone with her husband, she didn't see someone approaching or running up behind her. The attacker repeatedly struck her on the head. At least one blow must have caused her to weaken or lose consciousness, preventing her from screaming, and the assailant had the opportunity to drag her into the bushes without resistance. The murder weapon was covered in blood and was found next to the pool of blood where Katie was discovered. The forensic expert concluded that Katie died from head injuries. However, before that, the killer spent quite some time with her, committing various acts of violence. He left his semen on her body and skin particles on the murder weapon, which allowed the experts to retrieve his DNA. The DNA was cross-checked with the database, but there were no matches. After spending 2 hours at the crime scene, officers realized something was missing. Katie was on the phone during the attack, so where was her phone? It turned out the phone was on, and a ping led the police to an apartment building where 23-year-old Juan Sanchez lived. However, if investigators thought they would quickly arrest the suspect and close the case, it wasn't so simple. The young man explained that he was biking on the trail when he stumbled upon the phone without its owner nearby, so he assumed it was okay to take it. Juan showed the police where he found the gadget, and it was right near the crime scene. His words were trustworthy but not entirely convincing. He was asked to provide a DNA sample, and he readily agreed. Preemptively, it soon became clear that Juan was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the sample. He had merely found the victim's phone and was not the killer. However, since DNA comparison was going to take some time, the police delved into Katie's life. In such a fierce attack, the perpetrator is usually someone known to the victim, especially if the victim is a woman. First and foremost, detectives focused on Katie's ex-husband. What if the woman's second marriage had triggered jealousy and rage in him? However, despite the difficult divorce, there were no signs of animosity between the former spouses. Furthermore, Jeffrey had an alibi which ruled him out as a suspect. Before marrying Johannes, Katie was dating another man who lived in Germany, but on the day of the murder, he happened to be in the city due to interesting circumstances. Moreover, Katie had met him just 2 days before her death. Yet again, they couldn't link the man to the crime scene or establish a motive. What if the new man in the woman's life was responsible for her death? It wouldn't be the first time a man didn't want to be tied down by the bonds of marriage, but wasn't content with a divorce either. Usually money becomes a factor, such as insurance. Certainly, Johannes was thousands of kilometers away from his wife and spoke to her on the phone. On the other hand, he knew her schedule better than anyone, knew where she would be and at what time. Could he have hired a hitman? However, the murder weapon indicated that it was a spontaneous, not a planned crime. Besides, a hitman would likely have tried to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible rather than tormenting the woman. Everything suggested that the victim and the killer hadn't been acquainted before the incident. Therefore, detectives doubled their efforts to find witnesses who might have noticed something unusual on the trail that day. People recalled walking there themselves or with their pets, going to work, riding bikes. One cyclist remembered a stranger asking him for a cigarette. Overall, it seemed like an ordinary day, not hinting at anything out of the ordinary. Despite the shock that something like this had happened on the trail where they felt safe every day, a few witnesses remembered a man acting strangely. He was pointing at the canal, showing fish, as if trying to attract the attention of passers-by. 2 unrelated individuals asked to collaborate with an artist and ended up producing 2 remarkably realistic and similar composite sketches of this man. The only difference was the sunglasses that the man had on his head. The composite sketches were publicized in the media, and the public was asked for assistance. This prompted hundreds of calls from people eager to help. Furthermore, a reward was offered for assistance in apprehending the killer, $10,000 promised by the police, along with an additional $25,000 offered by Katie's company. The police compared the composite sketches with photos of local men who had been arrested for displaying aggression. The more they looked, the more they believed they had found a suspect, a man who lived in the area and was known to frequent the trail. He had been arrested for minor offenses and for assaulting a judge. His name was John Kaler, a 32-year-old. John was a mechanic who suffered from several mental health issues. He had several offenses on his record, mostly related to driving under the influence and an impulsive attack on a judge right inside the courthouse. At that time, he was in handcuffs and was immediately pulled away from the judge, but the attack was documented. There were no other aggressive actions, especially towards women, registered against him. However, he was remarkably similar to the composite sketches. Additionally, The search efforts lost track specifically on the street where John lived. The police were convinced that this wasn't just a coincidence and that they had apprehended the killer. They even called Katie's relatives and informed them that they had found the prime suspect. Now, they needed to detain him as carefully as possible. The police arrived at John's father's house where he resided. His sister answered their knock. She confirmed they were at the right address, but John was no longer available to talk. John had died. On May 14th, the day after the investigation began, John went to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped. The police were allowed to search the house. They found another piece of evidence supporting their theory, a pair of sunglasses identical to those in the composite sketch. They discovered clothing with something resembling bloodstains on it, and in John's room there was a newspaper article about Katie's murder, along with the composite sketches of the suspect. What was the police supposed to think? Could this be a coincidence? It seemed like John had committed the crime, realized the police would be onto him soon, and decided to end everything by going to the bridge. The police were confident that they closed the case within 72 hours. The man's body was in the morgue. All they needed was to take his DNA and compare it to the sample found on Katie Lorac. Witnesses identified John Keller from a photograph as the man on the trail that day. The DNA check became merely a formality. Confident in their righteousness, the officers declared to the media that the case was solved and proclaimed that the cruel murderer and rapist, John Keller, had been identified. Journalists descended upon the man's relatives, demanding answers to their questions and not allowing them to mourn their son and brother peacefully. In response, they criticized the detectives for not waiting for the DNA comparison results. John Keller's sister and father were convinced that the police were mistaken. His father stated that it was irresponsible to connect several random facts and fit them into a picture of the murder. They destroyed the reputation of a young man that was already tarnished. "It's unthinkable," he said. The family was distraught. John could no longer defend himself, and they tried to do it for him. John's father underwent a polygraph test to prove that his son was at home at the time of the crime. The polygraph showed that he was telling the truth. A month passed, Katie was buried, and the police were no longer actively investigating, simply waiting for the DNA test results. And finally, that day arrived. The samples didn't match. John hadn't assaulted or killed Katie. It was a massive blow to the investigators. Not only did they lose a month of investigation, but they also intensified the pain of John's family, who had lost a son and brother. Moreover, even after receiving the DNA test results, they didn't inform the public and only acknowledged the truth after John's father's statements. They stubbornly continued to claim that he might be somehow connected to the case. That's when the Keller family offered their own reward of $5,000 to anyone with information about Katie's murder, because they wanted to clear their son's name once and for all. Police took DNA samples from at least 50 men, acquaintances of Katie or resembling the composite sketch, but no matches were found. Then, after 4 months, a breakthrough occurred in the case. Early in the investigation, when questioning witnesses, one man mentioned that during the time frame the police were interested in, he was biking on the trail and stopped to smoke. A stranger approached and asked for a cigarette. The stranger smoked 2 cigarettes and the cyclist smoked 1. They chatted briefly, and that was the end of it. This happened about 60 meters from where Katie was found. The police decided to follow up on this lead, although it had been a week since the crime. They found a spot with 3 cigarette butts on the ground. Fortunately, they hadn't been rained on, and after 4 months, the DNA comparison result came back. The stranger who asked the witness for a cigarette was the rapist and murderer. But now the challenge was how to find him. The only hope lay in the memory of the cyclist. Miraculously, after 4 months, he recalled that the man worked in the telephone marketing field in a neighboring town. There was only one such company in that town, so armed with composite sketches, because that's all they had, the police went there. Employees immediately recognized 38-year-old Robert Ward Fraser in the images. However, he hadn't shown up for work since May, almost immediately after Katie's body was discovered. They couldn't locate him at his address. His former girlfriend confirmed that he had left a long time ago and presumed he might have returned to his hometown, but she wasn't certain. However, she found something useful for the police: Robert's toothbrush. Again, a DNA test would take time, and it wouldn't hurt to investigate the suspect for the time being. The man had a history of legal issues, having been arrested 9 times, particularly for robberies and related to illegal substances. He was known for his aggressive behavior in prison. He closely matched the witnesses' descriptions, and an arrest warrant had been issued in Indiana for violating parole conditions. Contacting the Indiana police, the Concord, California officers couldn't believe their luck when they were informed that Robert had tried to return to his hometown and was naturally arrested. Detectives flew from California to Indiana to talk to him. During the interrogation, the man was relaxed, slouched in his chair, joked, and didn't resemble someone afraid of anything. He confirmed that he lived in California, was near the crime scene, and smoked cigarettes with a cyclist around the time of the murder. Robert admitted he heard about Katie Lorac's case on TV, but when the police clarified if he remembered what the woman looked like, he answered that she had long hair, seemed to be a brunette, and guessed that she had freckles. Caught, thought the officers, he provided information that only the killer could have known. Katie did indeed have freckles, but they were not visible in any of the photos shown in the news. The freckles were not on her face, especially since she used makeup, not on her hands, but on the woman's chest. More precisely, between her breasts, meaning only someone who had seen her naked could know about it. And he couldn't have just guessed that. Detectives informed Robert that they had the perpetrator's DNA, to which he started talking about relieving himself in the bushes. In other words, he chose the same spot as the rapist. However, semen was found on Katie, which was an entirely different story. Robert's defense began to crumble, and the detective tried to press him, showing him the bloodiest photo of the victim and asking what she had done to deserve such a thing. Robert claimed he didn't want to see it and that he was not guilty. He sounded quite convincing. The suspect refused to communicate further without a lawyer, but his confession wasn't necessary. His DNA was taken, and it matched the DNA on Katie and on the murder weapon. Witnesses identified Robert as the person they saw on the trail. He was charged with violence, sodomy, and first-degree murder. He faced the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial took place in May 2006. The prosecutor systematically walked the jury through the events of that day. Robert came to the trail with intentions to satisfy his most base desires. He chose Katie because at that moment there were no witnesses on the trail. He grabbed the first weapon he found and attacked the woman, who was talking to her husband on the phone and was unaware of the danger. The prosecutor stated that what we don't know and will never know is how Katie experienced her last moments of life. She is not here with us to tell whether she begged, cried, pleaded for her life, or if she was even conscious after the first blow while the assailant continued to torment her. He then killed the woman, all for a few moments of pleasure. The defense attorneys tried to save the defendant's life, telling the story of his childhood suffering from both physical and psychological violence. However, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. He awaits the execution of the sentence at San Quentin. On November 6, 1994, Revel Balain stands on the platform of Newcastle Railway Station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Revel, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Revel Balain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city center. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Revel does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Revel Balain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Revel on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Revel met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher-Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Revel had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Revel started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, Upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Revel's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Revel was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Revel never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Revel's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Revel had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Revel spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Revel suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Revel headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Revel was working for 2 different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanojevic and Zoran Stanojevic. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Revel called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Revel arrived at Gavin Samer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Revel used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later, at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Piers messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she lay down to rest. Piers easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Revel called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Piers. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m. according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Revel when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Revel's boyfriend Piers sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Piers had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Piers constantly messaged Revel on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Revel's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Revel's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Revel wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Revel still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Revel's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Revel's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Revel's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Pierce, reported Revel missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Revel's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revel, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revel was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revel. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revel and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revel, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revel by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revel's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revel parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revel family claimed that the police considered Revel's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revel. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revel exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revel. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revel's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revel. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revel. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revel's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revel Balain? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revel, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that, but he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revel's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revel was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact, his words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later, a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revel that night. As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbor, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revel's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revel was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbor. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revel family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyer stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revel staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revel's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revel and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revel. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revel's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revel. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revel's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revel's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name, but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revel's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revel was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m. But for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revel's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revel was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revel Balain's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revel disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revel wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revel, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revel simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revel was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovich. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revel Balain's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer.